I argue in Satanian, as I have in my book Prometheism, that there's a lot of evidence we're living in a computational cosmos, in a quantum computational information processing system. And that this trickster entity is actually the mother of the matrix that we're ensconced in. And that she has a very personal interest in fostering the evolution of individuals and societies that have a creative capacity that would be useful in negating entropy to the greatest extent possible. This entity's primary concern is essentially the death of the universe.
Hey everybody, welcome to another Break the Rules show. I'm your host, Lev Polyakov, and it is a great honor to be here tonight for the BTR Christmas Special, talking about Satan, talking about UFOs, extrasensory experiences, and we have with us the wonderful Jason, Reza, Jorjani in the house, and we finally got Uberboyo to come over here, all the way from Ireland. Uberboyo, Steph, it is a great pleasure to finally see you here in person, brother. And we have a wonderful amount of people here. We have, I think, 11 people who are watching this right now. Guys, give yourself a round of applause. Thank you guys so much for being here. And we are going to start. Let's kick it off to Jason, and be sure to like, subscribe, click the bell. Patreon.com/breaktherules. All the patrons see it first before everybody else does. And yeah, Jason, let's go for it.
So this Congressman, Jeff Van Drew, representative of New Jersey, comes out and says that high-level intelligence officials have told him that an Iranian mothership is launching these drones from off the east coast of the United States, presumably outside the 12 nautical mile, territorial waters of America. And he feels confident enough to state this on Fox News. A lot of people, especially in some of the circles we're associated with, thought that this is warmongering, that it's attempting to, create a casus belli for war with Iran and so on and so forth. But actually, that doesn't make a lot of sense because the United States government refused to acknowledge that it was a foreign adversarial capability, right? So even before Congressman Van Drew made this statement, there were people speculating that it might be some foreign power and that the U.S. doesn't want to acknowledge this because it would be tantamount to a declaration of war. We would, have to declare war on whatever country violated our sensitive airspace in this way. And some of these drones are flying over very sensitive military installations in New Jersey. Okay? I was sympathetic to the idea that it could be Iranian drones for a number of reasons. First of all, going back to, I think it was maybe 2017 or something like that, 6-7 years ago, the Iranians managed to electronically capture a state-of-the-art American drone, land it intact, and reverse engineer it. And they've done the same with Israeli drones. It's been known among people who study military capabilities and, in defense journals and so on and so forth for years now, that there are a few particularly asymmetrical warfare capabilities where Iran leads in the world, together with a handful of other countries. One is cyber warfare, another is drone manufacturing. And if it weren't the case that Iran was a leading drone manufacturer, the Russians wouldn't be buying drones from Iranians to use in Ukraine. So it's not so bizarre considering Iran's drone capabilities. And there was this other story from about 5 years ago, maybe around 2020, where I was paying close attention to Iran, having just written Iranian Leviathan. And this story was reported over the Persian media, where American naval commanders in the Persian Gulf, commanders of aircraft carriers and destroyers, were claiming to have had their naval assets closely overflown, like in a very aggressive, taunting manner, by what they believed to be Iranian drones, which did not appear on radar. In other words, they were stealth drones, and they also couldn't be jammed in a conventional way. So, and they were convinced it was Iran and kept warning Iran to stop. So there's a trajectory of potential development here that could lead to Iran being able to field this kind of capability. And I also found it convincing because if it was a foreign adversarial power, I think we could rule out the Russians and the Chinese on account of the fact that If the Russians or Chinese want to surveil our sensitive facilities, all they need to do is look with a spy satellite. They have the same kinds of spy satellite capabilities that we have. And if they wanted to demonstrate a capability to hit a city like New York, since all of these drones are flying around New York City, basically, they can do that with an ICBM. So I thought it was unlikely to be China or Russia, or even North Korea that can hit the United States with an ICBM, could hit any American city with an ICBM. It's likely to be a country that lacks spy satellites and it lacks an ICBM capability and wants to demonstrate nonetheless the capacity to surveil American installations and to hit a city like New York. And I also found it interesting that, the only way to bring down these drones is to use something like an EMP that drops any aircraft from out of the sky in the particular region that the drone is flying. And it just so happens these drones are flying between Newark Airport and JFK Airport, the most heavily trafficked air corridor in the United States, meaning that in order to use that kind of a weapon, all air traffic would have to be grounded in basically the air traffic nexus of North America, at which point the U.S. government would have to admit that, our airspace had been invaded.
And then go to war.
Exactly. So this is tactical thinking. I mean, to my mind, this is not, how whatever intelligence is behind UFOs would think. It's how a foreign adversary would think. So I was inclined to believe that it was Iran. And by the way, the implications of that are staggering, okay? Because another reason why I found it compelling is that Hezbollah was just crushed by Israel and Lebanon. And, within the last week or so, the Syrian regime fell, and the Israelis established total air dominance over Syria. So I was thinking maybe the regime in Tehran is saying, all right, this far but no further. And it was sending a message to the United States that it would not tolerate, any attempt at regime change in Iran. And in that context, the implications are staggering because basically it means that the United States is being held hostage by the Islamic Republic of Iran, especially considering the fact that I think last week it came out that right after the November election, the Biden administration gave another $10 billion to the regime in Tehran. So this would be the most humiliating thing you could imagine, us giving $10 billion to them and then them invading our airspace with all these drones and not only surveilling sensitive military installations, but you have any idea what 80 armed drones could do to New York City? I mean, if, 9/11 would look like a firecracker by comparison. If each of these drones has a bomb on them and you fly them into the skyscrapers in the city that they're circling basically right now in New Jersey, well, it would be a catastrophe the like of which this country's never seen. I mean, Pearl Harbor was way out in Hawaii, and 9/11, it would be a lot worse than 9/11. So the implications are staggering, and it was maddening for me to think that the regime in Tehran could be doing this. In the last, 24 hours or so, I've been looking much more carefully at some of the really good footage that's come out of orbs over the sky in New Jersey, turning into drones. The footage is really good, and it's multiple videos put out by people who clearly haven't faked, this footage with any kind of, CGI. There's one woman who's standing on a golf course, and she keeps being hit by the sprinkler system on the golf course, and the camera is shaky and so on and so forth, but it adds to the authenticity of the video. And you can very clearly see at least 3 different orbs turn into structured craft.
The same kind of craft as these drones that have been seen?
Exactly. And now they say these drones, they have stealth capability. They can't be seen on radar. Well, UFOs also often aren't seen on radar. And it brings me to something that I actually opened my book with. My latest book, Satanion, opens with a chapter called Diabolical Disclosure, where I talk about the mystery airships of 1896, 1897. It's the first modern UFO wave in America, where you had Jules Verne-esque airships appear in about, 10 different states in America. And they were reported on in the newspapers of, 40 different states. It was widely covered in the press for something like 9 months between 1896 and 1897, that people were seeing these airships that were nothing like the blimps that we later came to know. They were not gas-filled Zeppelins. They were craft that looked like something from out of the science fiction of H.G. Wells or Jules Verne. And they were observed by many, many people. And again, reported on in newspapers and with testimony from sheriffs, from mayors of cities. Mayors of cities walked up to these things and touched them. They landed in people's fields and asked for resupply at times. And but here's the thing. So I wrote this book, Closer Encounters, in 2021. I came out with this book, Closer Encounters, right at the beginning of this whole disclosure wave. And in that book, I had theorized that maybe these mystery airships were some kind of early electrogravitic technology developed on the basis of an alternate physics paradigm that was then being put forward by Nikola Tesla and that was later developed by Townsend Brown as well. A physics theory that postulated the existence of a dynamic ether based on hidden elements and aspects of Maxwell's equations. So in the late 19th century, Maxwell's equations laid out basically the physical principles of electromagnetism. And there are people who claim that when 20th century physics textbooks were written, these equations were simplified in a way that occulted certain aspects of his theorization of how electromagnetism works. And that this was done deliberately in order to cut off a certain trajectory of technological development. Why? Because at that time you had railroad magnates like the Harriman brothers running the rail lines, the first rail lines across the United States. And then in the very early 1900s, Rockefeller discovered oil that was marketable. So you had the oil industry arising and the railroad industry arising more or less, simultaneously in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And had there been an aerial propulsion system that did not require oil and that would have been more expedient than railroad, transport, it would have been a catastrophe for both of those extremely lucrative industries. So I forward this theory in Closer Encounters that, maybe there were secret airship inventors whose patents and designs were bought up by these railroad magnates, by Rockefeller. And in particular, I theorized that J.P. Morgan was behind this. And the reason that he screwed Nikola Tesla and appropriated his patents was so that, they would never be publicly developed. But I went back and looked more carefully at the airship mystery of 1896, 97, a couple of years after I came out with Closer Encounters. And in particular, if you look through the study of this that's been done by John Keel in Operation Trojan Horse, and to some extent also the Mothman prophecy, people were reporting all different types of airships to the extent that sometimes the same people, let's say in San Francisco, looking at, a couple of airships in the sky, or looking at the same airship in the sky, at one point, one of these airships flew so low that it cast a searchlight onto the Cliff House in San Francisco. People looking at the same airship saw two completely different things. Some people only saw amorphous lights, like orbs, basically, at the same time as other people saw a structured craft. So the perceptions of witnesses varied significantly. And all of the witnessed airships are equally impossible from a technical standpoint. So for example, if you look at Nikola Tesla's designs for wingless aircraft, they do look like cigar-shaped UFOs because they don't need, propellers and jet engines or anything like this. But they make sense. I mean, they're like very simple cigar-shaped craft. That's not what people were reporting in 1896, 1897. They were reporting stuff that looks like it came out, from out of Jules Verne. Like,
different varieties, like it's never the same one.
Yes, and, things with bat wings on them, like all kinds of weird stuff that could never really fly. And so I started looking at this, and I thought to myself, wait a minute. This looks more and more to me like some kind of psychotronic manipulation of witnesses, that there is an intelligence behind this which is capable of materializing different apparitions in an interaction with the consciousness of the observer. And there are other stories that John Keel in particular covers in his ufological research of people who've seen UFOs turn into helicopters. So they're observing what appear to be UFOs, and then these UFOs turn into conventional helicopters, and vice versa. So I discussed this in chapter 1 of Satanian, Diabolical Disclosure. I go back and I revise my assessment of the 1896-1897 airship mystery, in particular focusing on the case of the patent attorney who claimed to represent the airship inventor. It was a guy named George Collins. And he was interviewed by the San Francisco Chronicle and made all these claims about how, he was representing this genius airship inventor and that the technology was soon going to be made public. People are going to be able to invest in the New York Stock Exchange and this new technology. And then I think it was 2 days later or something, he was called back into the office of San Francisco Chronicle because they wanted another statement from him. And he said, I never made any of those statements. I never said anything like that. And they said, what are you talking about? You sat here in front of our journalists and you gave us 2 hours of testimony. Anyway, long story short, it turned out that he gave that testimony in a state of trance, in a mediumistic trance. He was mesmerized the entire time that he gave this testimony. And he had given the name of the airship inventor as something Benjamin, E.H. Benjamin or something like that. And they went and they found this guy. And the guy turned out to be a dentist whose specialty was making dental bridges. He had invented new dental bridges. Except his dream from childhood was to invent an airship. And he had this pathetic little model of an airship. So it becomes this bizarre thing that involves mediumistic trances, somebody's dreams from boyhood of what he had wanted to do in life. And this patent attorney was actually representing the guy who invented the dental bridges.
So there was some kind of a psychic connection already between those two.
Exactly. And then this phenomenon was manipulating both of them. So I talk about this in chapter 1, of Satanian. And it occurs to me, just to bring this around, that it's possible what's going on with these drones is the same thing, that they are some kind of a psychokinetic or psychotronic manifestation that interacts with the consciousness of observers. And that just as they took the form of airships in the late 19th century, when people were imagining airships, and just before we invented Zeppelins, now when drones are the thing, they're taking the form of drones. And there's another element here that's very sinister, which is that the U.S. government, I think its UFO cover-up began actually around about 1900, long before people imagined. I think the Roswell, 1947, et cetera. But when David Grush came out recently and went on this tour of giving testimony, he alluded to the fact that the earliest U.S. government involvement was actually even before the 1930s. He said that there was a crash in Magenta, Italy, that the United States government involved itself in, and eventually, after World War II, retrieved this material from the Italians, but that this wasn't the first one, and the U.S. government was involved way before, but he couldn't talk about that because he wasn't cleared to. And I suspect that what he was referring to was the U.S. government involvement in investigating the mystery airship sightings of 1896, 1897. And very long story short, the reason the U.S. government got involved is because the second patent attorney that came out and claimed to represent these airship inventors said that the airships were being developed to go bomb Havana, Cuba. There was a civil war going on over there at the time, and there was a question about whether the U.S. government should get involved in this conflict vis-a-vis, America's geopolitical standing in terms of Spain and rivalries over control of Central and South America, with Spain. Anyway, long story short, the U.S. government was alarmed that there appeared to be an independent group of airship inventors who were going to fill these airships with TNT and go level Havana using them. Now, it turned out to be bullshit. I mean, there was no armed airship invasion of Cuba or anything like that. But point being, there was this menacing military angle to this manifestation already then. And if we consider the possibility that these are Iranian drones invading our airspace here, again, there's this menacing military angle, which threatens potentially the start of a conflict by manipulating people's consciousness. So it's possible that that's what's actually going on, and that, how apropos, of the time that my book comes out for us to be given another incredibly large-scale example of the type of thing that went on with the airship mystery of 1896.
Now, I want to make sure that I bring Steph into this conversation with a very demonic entity over here, Pikachu.
Don't say that about Pikachu.
No, I mean it in the good way, because it's daimons, these spirits of inspiration. Because one of the things that I think of, Jason, just to go on a slight tangent here in relation to Uberboyo in Ireland, is a bit fairy-like when it comes to these magical creatures that interact with human beings. And the fairies, would you say, Steph, that they also take certain forms that would be appropriate for the villagers to encounter, as opposed to something like, these UFOs?
Something Jason was saying a minute ago that actually sparked off a Jungian thought in my mind. I don't remember the UFO researcher, and you will remember him when I start talking, but Jung studied UFOs. I've done a video on this on my channel, but Jung studied UFOs, and he came up with a psychological theory. He says that people were projecting their imagination onto it, as Jung would obviously say. And a big part of this was, he was suggesting that these people aren't seeing reality. They're seeing what's inside their own heads and they would expect. And then I can't remember the researcher. He's very famous, and it just his name slips my mind. But
Jacques Vallée.
Vallée. Yeah. And Vallée comes along and takes that thesis, and obviously goes back to the fairies.
Yeah.
And he just extends it. Like, Jung proposes it, but this guy actually goes rock and roll with it. And what is the thesis? Well, of course, these are not three-dimensional entities. These are not floating ships. These are not this in the way that you might think. They're coming out of a higher dimension. They're fifth dimensional. And so it's impossible for us to interpret this because, we live in the third dimension. If we were to go down the second dimension, our fingers would splice through reality. We wouldn't even know what we're looking at. And so if there's something coming from a higher one, we have no context to process it. We can't even look at it properly. So we cast our imagination upon it. And so the fairies were probably the same thing, and everything that you're seeing now. So I don't know, are you proposing that the Iranians are out in New Jersey sending fifth dimensional superpowers down, or is there something more crazy going on? I don't know.
And there is one other connection I wanted to make with the Tuatha De Danann, because those particular, quote unquote fairies were described as being an aristocratic military class. And people who were, tall, and I don't know if they were blonde or redheaded, but regardless, they were people who can make petty humans around them start to go into convulsions, and they could control the weather. So are these also member branches of this spiritual energy, or are these people who are a little bit more human as maybe some of the other people responsible for this UFO phenomenon?
The fairy faith lore is incredibly complex and difficult to basically discern in categorically clear terms, much more so than the mythology and folklore of other religions. So one of the themes that is consistently running through a number of my books is the distinction between the gods and the titans, or what the Hindus called the devas and the asuras, or what we would call angels and demons. It's a subject that I address in a number of my books. And if you look at ancient Hindu texts and put them next to ancient Greek writings, even Plato in Timaeus and Critias and in Cratylus, he talks about gods and titans, in very detailed terms, and the conflict between them. And how, for example, the destruction of Atlantis had to do with a titanic rebellion on a global scale against the power of Olympus. Atlas was, of course, a titan, and Atlantis means the realm of Atlas. So if you compare the Greek myths and the Hindu myths, it's very clear that the Olympian gods are the devas, and the titans are the asuras. And then you compare that to the Bible, and it's, the Olympians are the angels, and the demons are the devas, or the titans. It still also maps onto Sumerian mythology. So you have, among the Anunnaki, you have the faction of Enlil, who is like Zeus or Indra or Yahweh. And then you have the faction of Enki, who's like Prometheus, basically, in the Sumerian myths. The titanic champion of humanity and the rebel against the power of Olympus. And by the way, Buddhism also takes this position. The demons of Buddhism are the asuras. And in the conventional Buddhist view, is that the devas are manipulative beings and they should not be worshipped. I mean, they're gods, lowercase g, but they ought not to be worshipped. I mean, this is one of the big breaking points between, Vedic religion, let's say. I mean, there's no such thing as Hinduism, whatever, but, between various forms of Vedic religion and Buddhism, one of the major points of divergence is that Gautama and other, promulgators of the Buddha Dharma after him were saying that the devas are manipulative, deceptive beings and they ought not to be worshipped. But they also said that these Asuras are driven by wrath and vengeance. They're like in Ahab mode. And, you shouldn't really follow them either.
Are they wrong?
Who?
The Buddhists who attribute these qualities.
I wouldn't say they're wrong. I would say it's a difference of perspective over, what, the meaning of life is and, what one ought to devote oneself to. Right, because I mean, one could argue, as Nietzsche did. I mean, this stuff like that. Buddhism was the epitome of a nihilistic worldview, and so if you think life is just suffering, then you're going to also reject someone who has Ahab's sense for vengeance and justice, because it's just more suffering that's going to come from out of that kind of a quest, right? So anyway, but my point is this about the fairies.
Yeah.
That when you do this kind of comparative mythology, as I have for many, I used to teach comparative religion, it's very easy to see these distinctions, across different traditions and different time periods. It breaks down when you look at the fairy faith. It's very hard to understand who these Tuatha De Danann, or, these gentry are, whether they're the ancient Celtic understanding of the gods, or whether actually they're like the Asuras, or what they are. And in my book, Closer Encounters, I end the book by basically discussing various manifestations of the trickster archetype, with some reference to Jung and Jung's discussion of the trickster. And in fact, Jung, the UFO study that you referred to, Jung's book, Flying Saucers, his conclusion ultimately is that the flying saucers, UFOs, are a modern manifestation of the trickster. And in that closing chapter of Closer Encounters, I suggest that the fairies are a manifestation of this trickster, that they're kind of either avatars or projections from out of the trickster. So this is an idea that I come back to in a big way in my book, Satanian. This idea of the trickster and the intermediaries and avatars and projections through which it interacts with humanity and has shaped our evolution. And has shaped our evolution with a view to fostering creativity and, catalyzing novelty and breaking us out from under, really rigid, ossified, narrow-minded control systems and hierarchical power structures.
I have a question for Steph. Would you say that there is also this idea of the trickster in what Nietzsche liked to talk about? Was he aware that there was some kind of an entity that was challenging us, that was putting all
entity?
Yeah, that was even if he was an atheist, was there like any spirit of the times, anything like that?
He doesn't necessarily think in terms of entities, but there's a gentleman called Ian McGilchrist. Do you know him? Mm-hmm. So he's a neuroscientist, and he actually looks through Nietzsche and notices many patterns of I would say right hemispheric, in the sense that he loved things like irony and paradox. Like Nietzsche would be obviously proposing something like mass morality, slave morality, and then the further he gets into it, he tries to find the irony between the two of them and clash them up against each other. He was big into that type of stuff. So he was very much a trickster spirit. And as you saw the descent of him into, I guess you could say, his madness, he started to maybe succumb to it a little bit, because you saw him oscillating between Christ and Dionysus. And Dionysus is very much like a trickster figure. So a seducer, perhaps, is the way to put it. But Nietzsche writes that way. He's trying to head fuck you. That's excuse me if I cannot curse on your wonderful show.
I'll curse all the way. I'll probably beep it.
All right, good stuff. Give it a good beep.
Yes.
A beep. If there's beeps on me, that means I'm saying too much. But yeah, that's what's going on. But the fairies are very much like that. People have a very bad assumption about the Irish fairies. They think, oh, I'll go to Ireland and there'll be like these mushrooms, and then there'll be these people dancing around them. And like to the
Smurfs.
To the actual, like, you don't go near the fairies. The fairies are like really dangerous, and they are fundamentally tricksters. There's this phenomenon called changelings, which Jason brought up the other day. And this is a really scary thing. I remember this when I was younger, where I think it was my granny. My granny was saying to me, "Oh yeah, you got to be careful around a newborn, because the fairies will change them. And I was like, about what? And apparently the fairies sneak into, it's like a parasite. They sneak into your house and swap the baby out with themselves. And then they start to like suckle the milk and take all your food. And then you grow a fairy and then it runs off. And your baby is like, taken underground and used in a torture chamber or something like this. And so there's always this like wary thing that you have to do special things to protect them from becoming changelings. And there was all these like stories as well where we've got these things called fairy forts. I think we were speaking about this.
Yeah.
And fairy forts are weirdly shaped like flying saucers. There you go. It's some people have mentioned the DMT trip. I'm not sure if anybody is a Terence McKenna fan here, but he would say the archetypal experience of DMT trip is to go underground into a dome-like, deep in the middle center of the earth place. And of course, that's where the fairies live. The fairies live inside these fairy forts, and they live underground in this central place. And if you're not careful, you're walking out drunk, which I'm sure many Irish people are, in the middle of the night, the fairies will come and get you, and they'll pull you down there, and they'll do stuff to you. And they're already small, but they're like really powerful. They can like seduce you and stuff like this. And this is maybe just mental illness that people project stuff onto, but there's a non-significant amount of stories of people like going around these forts and then coming back in, and they're just gone crazy. There was a guy. This is a really bad story, but it was around about actually 1890, I think you were saying, where a man killed his wife because she just started to like have mentally breakdown because she went to a fairy fort, and he told the priest about it, and the priest was like freaking out and trying to do an exorcism and all this. So this is big. Like the fairies are scary things, and I always see people talk about it, and I'm like, man, I don't want to go near that stuff. There was a fairy fort when I was younger nearby, and Granny would always be like, just don't play there, just leave that one alone. So
let me respond to something about that, because it just occurred to me, and we were having dinner discussing this.
Mm-hmm.
I can't believe it slipped my mind to tell you this when we were having that conversation, but of course, Celtic and Persian are cousin Indo-European languages. The fairies are very big in northern Iran, and our word for paradise in English comes from the Persian pari daeja. And Pari Deja means fairy fortress.
Oh, there we go.
And it's interesting because basically Pari Deja became the term to refer to Persian gardens created in the middle of the desert by bringing water from mountains in the north of Iran, these snow-covered mountains in the north of Iran, through underground channels that are cut in some cases through solid rock for hundreds of miles. They're called qanats or kanats in Old Persian. And they're one of the marvels of engineering in history, how these ancient Aryans who came to that plateau and named it after themselves were able to cut these channels, for hundreds of miles through solid rock to bring water for irrigation from, the mountains and the very lush green northern part of Iran where people to this day believe in fairies and are tree huggers, into the middle of arid, basically borderline desert territory, and create these enclosed gardens there, which they called Parideja, fairy forts. And the reason they called them that, though, is because in very ancient Iranian folk beliefs, the fairies would build these like manicured enclosures where there were different species of plants and animals brought from everywhere to create a kind of pleasure dome. It's like almost like what we think of in sci-fi, like you were to build, biospheres on Mars, right? It's that kind of idea that the fairies used to build these things.
Like an
way
arcology.
Back. An arcology, exactly. And so the ancient Persians were trying to replicate this. And our word for paradise comes from their word for a fairy fort, a parideja.
That's mad. I find it very strange how you have a string of those three archetypes among these phenomenon, which is, as I said, the fairy fort, which is this dome-like place that they bring you into, and like they play music with you and mess around with you and send you crazy. And the DMT experience, which is, you go down and then there's the magic elves and they're saying to you, you can create language with your soul and stuff like this. And then it's like, very spooky. And also the UFO experience. What's the archetypal UFO experience? You get pulled up there and they do surgery on you, and it's in a dome. Yeah. And there are all these weird guys doing surgery on it. It's very, very strange. And then on top of this as well is obviously like you want to see a binary, are they good, are they bad? But the attitude in Ireland is interestingly like classic pagan magic, where they're just a force, like any animal. and it's not maybe good to see them as like good or your friends, just like like a wild animalist and your friends, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad. In some sense, they can even be reasoned with. And the whole idea behind like a magician, if you so will, is that they would understand how to interact with the fairies. But the thing is that the fairies always win. They always trick you. This is this thing. So you can do deals. It's like deals with the devil. You can do deals with them.
The house wins.
Yeah, but the house wins. So this is actually like, you would see this an awful lot in like folk tales and stuff where that you try to do a deal with the fairy to get something, and then they would like, do it, and then you try to outwit them to get out of it, and then these all evolved actually into Christian myths, so stuff like this, and it's that sort of kind of neutrality in terms of morality, and it's weird that you see a lot of people talk about UFOs in the same way. Like there's a kind of broad array of different types, and you're interacting with something. There's much more going on than you think, and if you start to think of it like an animal world, like a jungle, and you have to interact with the species, it becomes quite interesting. But obviously, dire warning: be careful when you're playing around with this stuff.
Totally. I wouldn't say neutrality, though. I would say that what it is that it exceeds and violates and ruptures our binary definitions of morality, which have been put in place since the dominance of the Abrahamic religion. Both, Christianity in Europe and also Islam in Iran and the Persianate world, where in both places we had this much more ambiguous pagan, sense of the fairies being ambiguous in their motivations. And this brings us really, in a way, to the heart of my book, Satanion, because one of the things I'm trying to do in this work, as I've, tried to do in previous books of mine, is to deconstruct this binary moral categorization between good and evil and so on and so forth, a revaluation of values that is furthering the project of Nietzsche. And, you're right. I mean, Nietzsche clearly doesn't write about a trickster entity, but he embodies the trickster spirit. And the way in which Nietzsche makes himself the John the Baptist of the coming Antichrist, the herald of, the satanic, force on the earth, is something I've very much appropriated in my work. And Nietzsche is doing that not in order to set evil over and above good. He's doing it in order to polemically deconstruct a binary moral categorization, okay? And to be able to understand the spectrality of human existence, which is what he called becoming, an ontology of becoming rather than of being, to be able to understand the spectrality of human existence in a way that offers us more potential for creative development than being straitjacketed within this black and white moral sensibility that was inculcated by the Abrahamic religions. In particular, in my book, Satanion, I go back to very ancient Iranian, ancient Aryan folklore from the Caucasus. The Caucasus was Iran until about 200 years ago, the whole of the Caucasus, until the Russian czars came and, won that territory from the Persians in the Russo-Persian Wars in the 1800s. So in the ancient Caucasus, which is to say ancient northwestern Iran, there was this folklore and mythology of an entity called Satana. This is very old. Like we have this attested from, 800 BC or something like that. And for those who are not familiar, we actually don't have any evidence of the Old Testament that goes back before, let's say, 500 BC. So the Old Testament as a text is a lot younger than people think. Point being, Satan appears as a term way before it does in the Old Testament. It appears in northwestern Iran, and it's a feminine figure, not a masculine figure. So Satan is this Gorgon titaness, actually. She's not a goddess. She's a titaness associated with the Ashuras, or to put it in old Iranian, Ahuras. And she lives under the Caspian Sea. And she basically takes, every now and then, heroes down under the sea to be initiated in this magical kingdom and trained to become champions for her cause in the world. And she confers a broadsword upon them before she sends them out into the world. And she's also the guardian of a Grail. The Grail is called Jam-e Jamshid. Okay? So Jamshid is basically Atlas. In ancient Iranian mythology, there was this king of the whole world who revolted against the gods, and he bound some of the gods, the devas, the divs, and forced them to carry his throne up into the heavens, to storm heaven, as it were. And the Persian New Year, to this day, Nowruz, the Persian New Year celebrated the spring equinox, is a commemoration of the raising of the throne of Jamshid, Takht Jamshid, into the heavens. Jamshid and his civilization were punished with the freezing over of the Aryan homeland, which is the only version of the destruction of Atlantis myth that involves a freezing of a territory rather than a massive flooding. Which incidentally is interesting because during the Great Flood, the territory that froze instead of being flooded over was Antarctica. But let's just put a pin in that, okay? And the ancient Iranian myths say the Iranian people come from this place. They call it Aryanam Vaja, the seed cradle of the Aryans. Anyway, so this Satana, she's the guardian of this Jam-e Jamshid, the Grail of Jamshid. And it's a goblet or cup of some kind that lets you see everything going on in various parts of the world. You can look into it and see what's going on contemporaneously in the world, like clairvoyantly, or like as if it's some kind of like a satellite surveillance system or something.
It's the Palantir in Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And you can see across time through it, right? And so she's the guardian of the Grail, and she confers these broadswords on these heroes. This is a mythology in northwestern Iran in the Caucasus. The people of that region, during the collapse of the Roman Empire, flooded into Europe, where they became known as Alans. Arons were the original term. Arons are Aryans, and then they became known as Alans in Europe. And they became very fundamental to the high culture of the medieval epoch. They were the highest level advisors to the Carolingians and the Merovingians, and they especially impacted the culture of Occitan in southern France. And in particular, this whole medieval culture of powerful landowning ladies, where these women had huge estates, and they had knights serving them, and they had troubadours, minstrels, composing poetry in their courts and performing for them. This is Alan culture from the Iranian Caucasus being transplanted into Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire. So it's a huge mistake, that people think the only barbarians entering Europe during the collapse of Rome were Germans. No, there were also a huge number of Alans that came in. And these Scytho-Sarmatian people, these northern Iranians, they hybridized a lot with the Germans, and the Saxons came from out of that. They intermarried with Goths, and a lot of archaeologists say it's very hard to tell the difference even between a Goth grave and an Alan grave. The cultures became so hybridized and similar. Anyway, long story short, as I could see in your face when I was recounting this, the Arthurian Grail mysticism comes from this. And specifically how it happened was, as early as the period of Marcus Aurelius, Caesar Marcus Aurelius defeated a bunch of these Sarmatians. And he sent them to Hadrian's Wall because he wanted them as far away from their own homeland in the east as possible, but they were great warriors, so he didn't want to kill them. So he sent them to Hadrian's Wall, and the Roman commander under whom they served was named Artorius. So they then took this, folklore and mysticism of theirs and basically hybridized it with local Celtic traditions under this Roman commander, and it turned into basically the legend of King Arthur and the Lady of the Lake. So Satana becomes the Lady of the Lake, and instead of it being the Caspian Sea that she's under, it's, the lake. So all this business about, the Morrigan, Morgana, and so on and so forth, it goes back to this Gorgonic mysticism of northern Iran. Gorgonic. The women in the entourage of Satana are the Gorgons of Greek mythology. So, in the Greek myths, Greek heroes are always going up against the Amazons, and they're always fighting with Gorgons. And this had a cultural significance. It was the Greeks fighting against Sarmatians and Scythians, northern Iranian peoples, who, in the case of the Sarmatians, were a matriarchal warrior society. And in the case of the Scythians, were these, hulking barbarians who worshipped Gorgons, who worshipped these women with snakes coming out of their hair. and who were seen as basically the witch's coven of Satana. And Satana herself was the mother of all the Gorgons. So this original female Satan of the Caucasus was also associated with the serpent, which of course becomes, the key symbolic association of Satan in the Bible, the serpent or the dragon.
As well as a Kundalini within the Indian faiths.
Yes, and the banner of the Amazons or Sarmatians, their war banner, was the dragon. So the first dragon that appeared in Europe was the dragon on the banner of the Amazons or the Sarmatians who kept coming up to fight against Greek warriors, and then later against Romans.
The Vikings had dragons on their ships as well, didn't they?
Yeah, but that's a Viking culture where now we're talking like 1,000 or 1,500 years later.
But do you see continuity? Or is
Totally, because in ancient Iranian geography, cultural geography, the Scythians are called Sakas.
Oh, yes. Okay.
And there are a form of Sakas called Apasakas or Abasakas, which means the water Scythians, the Scythians who travel across the waters.
Yes, okay.
And basically, like, they were the proto-Vikings. And when the Scythians came into Europe, Scythians and Sarmatians, two closely related northern Iranian groups, came into Europe during the collapsing Roman Empire, they massively hybridized with Germanic people. And probably from out of that is where the Viking culture came.
Would it also be fair to say that the Christian chivalry that we see during the Middle Ages is basically these human beings trying to emulate the kind of life that these fairies have?
I thought you were going to go somewhere else with that.
No, but it's still close, because what you were talking about with the fairy forts, you have these entities that have all of these various traditions of theirs, and then the human beings seem to emulate what they're doing.
Well, I would put it this way, that certainly it's not Christian. The culture of chivalry of the Middle Ages, I mean, you have to be an ignoramus not to realize that the culture of chivalry in the Middle Ages has nothing to do with Christianity. There have been extensive studies of this. One of them is From Scythia to Camelot. It's a great academic study of this subject, of where chivalry and Grail mysticism come from. Chivalry exists in Iran in 200 BC among the Parthians, who are a branch of the Scythians. They had an empire in Iran for 400 years. They were the main rivals of the Roman Empire, the pagan Roman Empire. And they're the ones who spread Mithraism into the Roman Empire. And this culture of chivalry, which is called Pahlavani or Javanmardi in Persian, was there in Iran for literally something like almost 1,000 years, 800 years before it appears in Europe. And it appears in Europe, not coincidentally, when the Alans and, the Scythians show up in Europe. So it's the culture associated with the people who worshipped these fairy-like entities. That much we can say.
I want to ask Steph, for the people who do not know what chivalry is, how would one be a chivalrous knight? How would one treat women? What are the basics of chivalry?
What are I don't really know it too well. I know definitely the Arthurian legends quite well, and I know romance comes out of this, but I don't know the strict definitions, I'm afraid.
Well, Jason, what would you say would be the qualities of chivalry? Like, if you were to be a chivalrous knight, what would be some of the tenets that you would have to live by?
Yeah, so look, it's actually very codified in ancient Iranian culture. And matter of fact, it survives even to this day. There are places in Iran called Zurkhanes, houses of strength. Zur means force or strength. So houses of force or houses of strength. And they're basically like ancient Iranian dojos, where ancient Iranian martial arts are practiced, which are Mithraic in origin. And they still to this day teach the code of chivalry there, which is called, again, Javanmardi or Pahlavani. Javanmardi means like being a mensch, like being a real man. And Pahlavani means heroism, basically. And there are certain basic principles of it. Like, for example, the most important one is azadegi, which means free-spiritedness. Being a free-spirited person, a person of a liberal spirit, which is very different from the spirit of late modern liberalism. Okay? So free-spiritedness meaning to each his own, do your own thing. Don't get in other people's business.
Like the Founding Fathers' ideals.
Very much so. It's like the cowboy mentality. Yeah. And by the way, these were the original cowboys. The Scythians were like literally horseback riding, cow herding people. They were original cowboys.
And when it comes to chivalry, Jason, is it like related to romance? Because I know obviously like you have the troubadours and all that.
100%.
Okay, but a lot of people would say it's a Christian effect on the pagans.
None whatsoever.
Okay.
So romance arises as a really discernible idea in Parthian Iran. And you have legends like romances like Veys and Ramin, which have survived in medieval forms, like 800 AD. Fakhruddin Gorgani from northern Iran wrote a new rendition of this Veys and Ramin. But scholars say it goes back to like 150 BC, and it's Parthian, because you can tell from what's in the story what the original cultural milieu was. And it's a romance. Matter of fact, it's an extremely pornographic romance.
Okay.
With a ton of sex and violence in it. It's very lamentable, the regime we have in Tehran, that these things can't be made into epic films. Should be made. In any case, it's very related to romance because in addition to azadegi, you have the idea of like beneficent charitableness. In other words, overcoming petty possessiveness. Look, that has to do with being charitable and looking out for the poor and a certain degree of social welfare.
Kind of Christian, right?
It's much older than Christianity, though.
Yeah.
We're talking about something that arose hundreds of years before Christianity. And don't forget the impact that Mithraism had on the rise of Christianity and shaping Christianity in Rome. But here's where I was going with this in terms of romance. Herodotus himself says in his histories that among the Scythians, who were an extremely strong warrior culture with like these hulking berserker, among the Scythians, if a Scythian woman wanted to have sex with some man other than her husband, he would put his bow, like some lover that she had it in mind to get involved with. He would put his bow outside her tent. And if the woman brought the bow into her tent, the husband had to go get lost for however long she wanted to, dally with this lover of hers, right? And the code of chivalry involves these notions also of a degree of free-spiritedness and beneficence between male comrades where, there isn't the kind of possessive relation toward women that gets institutionalized as, marriage qua property in most cultures. And you see this impact European culture in the Middle Ages with these Allen ladies and their estates, and, their knight husbands are off to war, and they're having sex with these troubadours and with other knights and so on and so forth. So these are two of them, azadegi and dahishmandi, charitableness. And then there are other, elements of this code of chivalry as well.
Wow. By the way, I want to hold the Pikachu just for a little bit. Speaking of possessiveness over here. But when it comes to the men who would, let's say, feel possibly left out, was that the case, or were all the men there so interconnected with each other that they understood that, like, it's no problem?
Let me answer it by telling you this interesting little anecdote. Scythian folklore that survived in Iran to this day includes this idea that it was very hard to find old people among the Scythians and also among the Parthians who broke off from the Scythians and made this empire for 400 years in Iran. In the early years of the Parthian Empire and among the Scythians, it was hard to find old people because you were supposed to go out and get yourself killed in battle. And unless you were some like battle-scarred, indomitable person who just could not manage to get yourself killed, you generally wouldn't grow old in that society. Barring if you were, say, a shaman. And these were the earliest shamans, by the way, that we have any record of. The oldest shamanic culture that we have a record of, which used Amanita, Muscaria to create Soma, that is the Scythian culture, where, Central Asian shamanism and so forth came from out of. So you had older members of that society who were shaman, wise women or wise men. But other than that, you were expected to go get yourself killed. Well, why am I saying this response? Point being, there weren't too many weak people in that society. That society had an inherently eugenic ethos.
There were no beta cucks.
This is kind of the thing. Look, and so to a modern mentality, these are two very contradictory things. Because if to a modern liberal mentality, what I'm describing sounds like a kind of libertinism or cuckery of like weak men in a type of society. Except we're dealing with the strongest society attested in recorded human history, of which the Romans and every other people that came up against them, the Greeks, were terrified.
The Spartans were like that too.
there was great similarities between the Spartan culture and the Scythian culture.
But
and
specifically with the cooking.
Yes, well, and I think it's one of the reasons, the general cultural similarities between the Spartans and Iranians is one of the reasons why in the Greco-Persian Wars, Sparta almost sided with Iran against Athens. It came very close.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm going to give Pikachu back because Pikachu as the female had some time with me, now some time with back with Steph.
My gosh, you're just passing her around. Pikachu's a dude, though, isn't he?
It depends on.
This is starting to get
well, no, Pokemon are different genders. Maybe it's a non-binary, so who are you to judge?
Okay,
but
right.
By the way,
I can check.
Could somebody throw the seal to us? There's also a seal, a chunky seal.
Should we do Q&A?
We are going to get to Q&A in a bit. Yeah, look at this chonker over here. Look at
Man,
this guy.
you feed your seal as well.
Mm-hmm.
You've also a binary as well. All right, there you go. Poor guy. What do you do to them, man? You just cut it all off the second they get in the door?
Jason, so the question that I want to ask you is in regards to where exactly the line is drawn between the human beings, who we are, and these various entities and Satan and all that, because it seems to be a relationship between the two where one emulates the other. So in the case of these UFOs, for instance, they're emulating, and again, not all UFOs, but the specific ones you mentioned, like the Orbs turning into these drones, they emulate whatever it is that we expect them to be like. Do you see there being a connection between both this spectral trickster entity and us as far as something that both of us have in common? And let me know what you think. Yeah,
I wouldn't say that they emulate whatever we expect them to be. I think that it's more subtle than that. Again, this is an argument that I start to unfold in my book Closer Encounters, and then I come back to in this latest work of mine, Satanion. It's more a kind of psychosocial engineering that's taking place. This trickster entity has as its motivation catalyzing the continued and further evolution of humanity toward a kind of superhuman or post-human condition. I mean, look, the devil's in the details, literally. So you'd have to read the book. But I try to make the case that this entity appears to have a very personal interest in us. In other words, whatever this consciousness is that's engaging us through the close encounter phenomenon, it does not appear to be radically alien in a way where we're not mutually intelligible forms of life. And if that were the case, it wouldn't be as intensely engaged with our history as it is, right? This entity seems to be continually involved in shaping and reshaping human history and offering basically provocations and catalysts for us to take evolutionary leaps and also to test the strength of various societies, right? And exercise some degree of evolutionary selection over what forms of life move forward into the future. Maybe we can unpack this in the context of Q&A, but I argue in Satanion, as I have in my book Prometheism, that there's a lot of evidence we're living in a computational cosmos, in a quantum computational information processing system. And that this trickster entity is actually the programmer or the matron of the matrix, right? The mother of the matrix that we're ensconced in. And that she has a very personal interest in fostering the evolution of individuals and societies that have a creative capacity that would be useful in negating entropy to the greatest extent possible. So that this entity's primary concern is essentially the death of the universe. This entity is actually engaged in a combat against death in the most profound and far-reaching sense. In other words, the heat death of the universe, entropy, cosmic entropy. And what her motivation is to cultivate negentropic creative potential in any and every pocket where she can find it, as a kind of motor of evolution. And that selection principle for evolution for her ultimately is to see what kinds of societies and individuals are most capable of resisting entropy by increasing complexity and dynamism on a cultural and psychological level.
So,
Yes.
you were bringing up, you said something interesting here now. You said the computer simulation theory. And we're talking about something where, you bring up the Matrix, you bring up all these. This is a set of archetypal ideas that leads towards Gnosticism, which you brought up Buddhist nihilism earlier, for example. I made a post on Twitter recently, steelmanning Schopenhauer. And what is Schopenhauer? Only the fundamental pessimist, saying that, yes, this is a simulation, but it's not a good simulation. You fundamentally must assume that this is evil, that the great female Maya, I'm not sure if this is Maya, by the way, but the illusionary witch.
I saw your post on Schopenhauer. I actually sent it to a few people.
Okay, good. It got them thinking. Well, this is it. So it's like the world that we're in is the Matrix, which is the mother, which is evil. It's like the reason
That's
why
Schopenhauer's perspective.
Yes, and it's a prison. It causes immense suffering, and we're also then dealing with the same phenomenon where we're talking about UFOs. I'm not sure if obviously you fully agree with this thesis, but like they're coming from the fifth dimension. They represent an outside set of forces that are coming in here and interacting with us, which I assume all entities would be in some sense. That's in a weird way affirming a lot of the Gnostic thesis, saying that this is a simulation. If it's a simulation, you have to assume that if there's evil in it, it's there for a reason, which is kind of crooked. It's like, are we trapped inside something computer simulation? Has these creators put evil in it? And it's like, why would they do that? That's psychotic. People like Buddha sort of saying that they want to escape from it. It starts to sound like pretty kind of like, yeah, you're probably going on the right track there. People like Nietzsche sort of saying, no, we must get rid of that otherworldliness and focus on this world, actually starts to look stupid, as if he just made a mistake and he tried to cast all that away, and then quantum physics comes along and proves the other world, and then Nietzsche's just a dummy, he was trying to be a trickster too much. How do you kind of slosh all these ideas together? Because it seems like you're like a Nietzschean trying to life affirm the simulation at the same time acknowledging it's a simulation, which seems like a very strong paradox when it's fundamentally down there. And I'm wondering, do you think about it this way? Maybe I'm framing it wrong. What's your thoughts?
I would say your framing is backwards in the sense that the Gnostics were relatively unsophisticated, ancient people who were trying to understand the fact that we live in a simulation. And the way in which they went terribly wrong was in terms of their various forms of dualism. First of all, their metaphysical dualism. The Gnostics believed that we're living inside of a material prison and that the simulacrum is of a fallen nature compared to some pleroma, some transcendental realm outside of this construct, and that the demiurge who created this construct is an evil being. So first of all, you have a metaphysical dualism between a fallen material world and then some transcendental realm, which is one kind of dualism that Nietzsche is already trying to deconstruct and implode, right? And I similarly, throughout my works with my notion of the spectral, I'm also trying to deconstruct this kind of ontological dualism. But then in the notion of the evil demiurge, the fact that the demiurge is evil, you have a moral dualism as well, where the Gnostics, they value, their moral valuation of this world is that it's evil and that its creator is evil. And that to be good is to try to transcend this world and basically leave one's physicality and corporality behind and ascend to the pleroma and become these basically immaterial, perfect beings of light. There's 20 different attested forms of Gnosticism running from antiquity into the Middle Ages, but these are basic themes that you find in a lot of them. And I'm trying to deconstruct both the ontological dualism and also the moral dualism, really in a furthering of Nietzsche's project. So I would say that, it's mistaken to see the thesis of us living in a quantum computational cosmos as Gnostic. Mm-hmm. It's the Gnostics who mistook what it means to understand that we're living in a construct. And in terms of the question of evil, right? Schopenhauer was a profoundly unpleasant, misogynistic, person who, I think should hardly be the standard of our valuation of the world and of our fellow human beings.
Did he have a bad mother, by the way, or?
I don't know, but I know he threw his landlady down the stairs and tried
to kill her.
There we go.
Yeah, so there we go. Anyway, in any case, look, I think that in terms of the question of evil, it's ridiculously simplistic to want to live in a world without harsh catalysts in it. I mean, that which doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Harsh experiences, shocks, trauma are all the catalysts and instigations of psychological growth and also growth for societies. I mean, you see this both as in Europe, as Nietzsche observes, with the deepening of the complexity of the European soul as a result of the trauma that was Christianity and the Inquisition and so on and so forth. So you can evaluate the Christian dominance over Europe and the Inquisition as something horrible, as I do in all my writings. At the same time, you can recognize that the complexity of modern European civilization and the depth of the European soul as it exists today is something far more profound than what existed in pagan antiquity before Christianity, right? So I'm not advocating some kind of neo-paganism. I'm advocating a post-Christian worldview, right? Which is what makes it satanic, in a sense. I mean, this is the classic argument between pagans and Satanists, where the pagans look at the Satanists and say, you all are not pagans because you're presupposing Christianity. And you could say the same thing in an Islamic context. I mean, I wrote a 400, 500-page history of Iran, right? And one of my arguments in that book, which was very controversial, and I took a lot of heat from Iranian nationalists over it. One of my arguments in that book is that the golden age of Iran, let's put it this way, the zenith of Iranian civilization, is not the first Persian Empire or the second Persian Empire. It's that period between 850 and about 1150. Which is often called the Islamic Golden Age, and a horrible misnomer. But that renaissance of Iranian civilization several hundred years after Islam is actually the zenith of Iranian civilization, not because of Islam, but despite Islam and in reaction against Islam. So it's like the European Renaissance. The complexity of the culture of the European Renaissance exceeds anything we saw in pagan antiquity. We had a similar Renaissance, a post-Islamic Renaissance in Iran, which was even more, let's say, satanic than what happened in Europe. If you read people like Fakhreddin Gorgani, which I was mentioning earlier, the Romantic poet, or Razi, the scientist, Zakaria Razi, you see a kind of contempt for organized religion in general and Abrahamic religion in particular that you don't see until the European Enlightenment. And there was an incredibly free-spirited culture in Iran at that time, which also yielded tremendous scientific discoveries and technical advancements. I mean, Iran is one of the handful of countries which, for a certain period of time, was the capital of science and technology in the world, from about 900 to 1200. And what ended that were the barbarian invasions of Turks first and then Mongols into Iran, where they genocided basically a third of the Iranian population and made, towers out of severed heads of the Iranians who resisted them. It wasn't Islam. It was the fact that these barbarous people from Central Asia, and, in the case of the Mongols, East Asia, came in and decimated the civilized population of Iran during this cultural renaissance. So point being, you can have a really terrible evaluation of Islam, as I do. I mean, I think it's one of the most horrible ideologies that has ever appeared on the face of the earth. At the same time, it catalyzed a profound transformation of Persian culture. And on the other side of this inoculant, an immune strength was developed in that society, which made it much stronger than what it had been before. So the Gnostics are very naive in not wanting there to be these kinds of evils in the world. These kinds of evils breed strength and increase complexity and foster dynamism.
Oh yeah, good answer actually. So it's like taking the view essentially, is this pro demiurge, taking the view that there is a creator making a simulation, and he's made a video game, but he's put inside of it like bad things. He's put
she.
inside of
In my case, I'd say she.
A female coder, the demiurge, we'll call her, code name demiurge.
Or in Judaism, it's like the left hand versus right hand of God, where the left hand is the punishing one, and it creates a kind of evolutionary pressure over time.
Well, the phrase that I've repeated several times in I think at this point 3 or 4 of my books even, is that God is an invention of the devil. And what I mean by that is that you have to read the book of Job backwards. When you look at by the way, the book of Job was written during the First Persian Empire, when the Persians had just freed the Jews from Babylon, and a Mithraic elite of magi basically took the Jewish community under its wing and fostered the evolution of Judaism. It's at that point that the Tanakh was codified, as the Persians helped the Jews to emigrate back to Israel and subsidize the building of the Second Temple at cost to the Persian treasury. That's when the book of Job was written. And interestingly, it's the first time you see this like dualism of God and the devil very explicitly in the Bible.
True.
What I argue from Iranian Leviathan onward in my corpus is that you have to read the book of Job backwards. In the book of Job, Shaitan, the adversary, Satan, works for God, and God sends Satan to test Job. And I would say it's the other way around. It's that, and if you really read Job carefully, again, the devil literally is in the details, you realize that it's Satan who creates the image of God, who creates the image of Yahweh, the tyrannical, sadistic demiurge, to test humans to see whether they have the degree of individuation and independent thought requisite to merit further evolution. Right? So the moral of the book of Job by the end is that God is not just. God has the power to inflict every form of injustice upon Job. And if Job had God's power, Job could do the same thing. It's a gospel of the will to power. That's what the book of Job really is. And no God says something like that. That is not a, divine or angelic or whatever message. It's a satanic message. And the moral of the story is, jackass, why are you bending over like this? Where is your spine? Who would worship a God like me?
Did you ever read Jung's Answer to Job?
I think it's too weak.
Yeah, I was assuming you were going to say that, but he basically comes to the thesis that God sadistically abuses him and then feels guilt and offers Christ as like an apology. Go kill me as a sorry. You torture me now as a sorry for this. And so you're just basically saying that it was more of an exposition and Job just took it, and it's like you're like a farm animal.
Yes, and that's ultimately how I read the Bible. The biblical religion was created by a certain Mithraic elite. Again, so look, there's a lot to unpack here, which we don't have the time for, but this figure, Satana, who I was talking about in northwestern Iran in the Caucasus, this figure is a figure from the most ancient form of Mithraism, the original religion of the Magi. And so I think a certain Mithraic elite fostered the biblical religion with a satanic or diabolical purpose, namely to test the submissiveness of humanity and to act as a catalyst for rebellion and individuation.
Have you, I apologize, I'm stealing all the questions now. Have you read Aion by Jung?
Yeah, I've read it years ago.
Well, there's a spin, I think, on what you're saying there that's quite interesting, because he talks about the oscillation between the Christian age and the anti-Christian age. And the whole narrative throughout it is the concept of the development of the conscience, which is like where we get guilt from, where we ultimately get morality from. And I think there's some very, very profound arguments in that, because if you look around at our world right now, it doesn't actually matter where most people fall. Everybody has a moral thesis. This is like Nietzschean relativistic morality. People think, oh, that means there's no such thing as good and evil. It actually means everybody projects a good and evil, but it's very hard to decide what's a correct one. So there's this obsession with morality and the conscience and guilt that is inside people's heads. And so as we've been evolving, it seems like we're now going into this technological age where we're essentially creating God, which is the Antichrist. And these were symbols even that started to show up into in alchemy, the alchemists were searching for the philosopher's stone. What has technology manifest for ourselves? We've got these stones that live. And the ultimate goal of all this stuff is to build AI, which is a living stone, a silicon stone that lives.
A Stanley Kubrick monolith over here.
Yeah, exactly. And we're sort of accelerating towards that point where we're like kind of giving birth to this thing. And in a weird way, if we don't have the mental strength, the mental dynamism to, I guess you could say, become conscious of the moral question, we're basically going to hand over all of our authority to AI, and it's just going to enslave us. It's going to be like the total punishment for being compliant religious herd people who just go slave moralists and just bow down to what you're told by the church is, in a weird way, an early version of a cybernetic system that sucks everybody into it and creates a hierarchy command like a nervous system. And then now this is evolving into the technology, because all of this stuff we're connected to a cybernetic system. And then the end goal is AI, where you're all like you're trapped, and inside of it is the God voice, that type of thing.
Just several things about Jung's Aion or Aion, right? I mean, this is a Greek word that can be pronounced Aion or Aion, and it's, if you notice in my book title, Satana, right? The Aion of Satana, Satana.
Okay.
One thing is, in the chapter on Christ in that book, in Jung's Aion or Aion, he portrays Christ as the perfectly pure being, the most perfect being, lacking any kind of impurity whatsoever, and the Antichrist is the shadow of Christ. That this overly perfect projection of the Christ necessarily involves the formation of the archetype of the Antichrist and its shadow being cast over history as a kind of negative destiny, right? But see, this is completely biblically ignorant. And you see this kind of biblical ignorance also in an intellect no less than Rudolf Steiner's. And these are a case of two really brilliant men, Jung and Steiner, both super geniuses, who can't sit down and read the goddamn Bible without projecting their own Gnosticism onto it, their own Gnostic idealism onto it. Because the Christ in the Bible is far from perfect. This guy tells you, like, I don't know how many dozen times that he's the son of Yahweh, and he's come to affirm the Torah, and not a dot of an I or a cross of a T of the Tanakh will pass away until the world ends. And even the scenes in his childhood where he's sitting down with the rabbis, he goes missing from his parents, and he's sitting down with the rabbis teaching them the Torah, right? Yeah. There are so many places in the New Testament, especially even in the Gospels, where Jesus affirms the Old Testament. Well, what's the Old Testament? Well, a genocidal maniac, Moses, leads, a bunch of miserable people out into the desert. And after they sing and dance around a golden calf while he goes up missing, up the mountain to talk to these entities, they form a statue of Hathor and they're celebrating around it together with the children. He comes down and he orders the massacre of men, women, and the children worshiping this calf statue. After him, Joshua is deputized to go conquer the promised land because it was promised by Yahweh. And how does he carry out this conquest of Canaan? More genocide, rape, and pillage, including the total destruction of the city of Jericho, its entire population, the slaughter of all the animals.
Well, except for the prostitute.
Except for the prostitute who sold out her fellow citizens. Right? Anyway, point being, and then the book of Ezekiel is just appalling. In terms of, and I mention Ezekiel in particular because you see at least 10 different accounts of UFOs in the book of Ezekiel. It's very clear that the entities inside what we would call UFOs are giving Ezekiel and these Kohanim instructions to go murder people who've deviated from the, Jewish law.
And these aren't the trickster aliens. These are the...
Well, here's where I'm going with this. That's the point I want to make with this, is that I think that the trickster intelligence is trying to see what forms of oppressive social organization and what retarded ideologies masses of humans are willing to accept and organize themselves according to. Because those people don't deserve to survive. This entity is running an evolutionary machine. And her purpose is to find a form of life that can help her to indefinitely resist entropy on a cosmic scale. And she has no business with people who are going to swallow the biblical religion, or for that matter, Islam, right? The Quranic message. And so these are ways to test the resilience of a society and its capacity to produce strong individuals and creative minds. That's what I mean when I say God is an invention of the devil. And why? So my first response about the book of about Aion is that he's completely misconstruing Christ, and he's doing it through Gnostic projections onto the Bible. And the other point I wanted to make is that where that leads him is to this quasi-Luddite view of technology, where, the AI that we're developing now is necessarily an expression of an evil antichrist, right? It's, again, another form of Gnostic dualism, the natural versus the artificial. Whereas, actually, we're living in a cosmos managed by an artificial intelligence. And as I've argued before, the alignment problem, the so-called alignment problem that engineers at OpenAI and Google are working on, in other words, the supposed challenge of aligning AI with human values, is completely misconstrued. First of all, there are no human values. We have, 5, 6 different major civilizations in the world. They all have conflicting value systems. The real alignment problem is the alignment of our AI with the existing AI managing this cosmos. Because if you think that the AI managing this cosmos is going to allow us to develop an AI that's not aligned with her, forget about it. Okay? So that's the real existential risk, is that we need to understand the motivation and the aim and goal of the entity that's actually managing and fostering evolution inside this computational cosmos.
Just one last thing on that, but I won't be long. But it's something actually I've been thinking about an awful lot. Like Nietzsche's prophecy, I guess you could call it, of focusing on morality. I also notice it in Jung with Aion, and I find it so fascinating how AI has literally shoved philosophy back into the forefront, because philosophy kind of had a bad reputation last couple of years, like tech engineering kind of humiliated it. And now you've got the super tech, you've got AI, these super machines, and you start to realize that yes, the moral coding, the moral biases that we have in our heads, our conscience is going to get projected into the machine. And if that's wrong, that could be awful. Like you could literally code the machine to kill mankind. Imagine if a Schopenhauerian got AI and made it, and you don't really have control over how a skilled person, what they think morally. So it's very fascinating that this seems to be, as we come close to, in some sense, the singularity, all of these moral questions, these essentially religious questions, get this enormous tempo put onto them, because it's like we're going to get the power of nuclear physics underneath our moral thinking, and a Wunderwaffen shows up, and we're going to be in trouble if we're not careful. So I think it's a big one. I'm definitely going to do videos on that stuff, but I guess we should pass the microphone finally out here.
Pass the Promethean torch of audio to the good people here.
Do you guys think that there's like a relation between what I refer to as like what's happening in our age, is like the divine feminine coming into like reality? It may be a consequence of unconscious forces that may be related to a Gnostic perspective of the world, resurging, maybe those certain values, I see as needing, to be balanced. I don't know if you mentioned in your book like a more patriarchal figure involved with that. It seems mostly focused on the female. But my question really was, do you guys see a relation between humans understanding their objective reality, objective collective unconscious, morality being almost a perennial, or not perennial, but morality being objective or subjective, you say, because different cultures have different moral values. Do you see us like I'm trying to phrase a question right?
Good, I'll follow. Keep going.
A simultaneity between like us becoming aware of that subjective substratum, or the objective one, like the collective unconscious, and us developing AI to the extent that a machine can be able to perceive and live in the world. Like there's a connection between that all happening simultaneously. Sort of. Is there a question?
Let me see if I even understand your question.
Yeah.
You're asking about our inculcating certain values into AI.
Our understanding of our own values.
Yes. So our understanding of our own values, whether there are perennial values, how the differences in values between various civilizations bears on the problem of imbuing AI with a value system.
Yeah, because AI is hard to develop. It's like they've been doing it for a long time. Having it to be able to perceive is this whole task in itself. So it's like there's a certain like you said, like or what you're talking about. I'm a little high, but Um,
Well, maybe I could say back to you what I think you're saying, because I think I do follow. Again, like the thing I was saying with nuclear power, but this is even more crazy because AI is in some sense able to reflect back to us. It's a technology that reflects back to us our power. Now, if we go in, if we are all Schopenhauerian and we create these machines, everybody's scared of Terminator killing mankind. Yeah. And that's because it amplifies what we are. And so you're sort of saying, like, if we're morally unconscious, I guess you could say, we're not in touch with like the source of, or the Nietzschean prophecy that like we have relative morals and all the different cultures have different morality. And we just think that's okay. People just say, I want to be Muslim or I want to be Christian because that's my religion and that's the right one. And it's like, well, that's great. But then when you amplify all this stuff with artificial intelligence, what if it turns out to be wrong? And you only really get one shot with that. Like if you plug in Skynet and the morality is wrong, it's like launching all the nukes. It's like it's over.
You're stuck in a hell, like a permanent hell.
Exactly. So you go and you like, man, have you been seeing what they're doing with the video games at this point? Like it's getting photorealistic. The image processors. There's
But it's getting photorealistic, but it's also getting very ugly in terms of the character design, which is part of this whole woke DEI bullshit that's been going on.
That's exactly the point. It's like so like take again. I'm just sort of reflecting what I'm thinking there. You're thinking there, but take the woke complaint. People complain about the woke. Now, why do they complain about the woke? Because the woke is the wrong values. It's the wrong values for our culture. Now, I remember looking at the woke when it first came up, and I noticed it was so close to Gnosticism. Because it's claiming that there's something sort of wrong with the world.
I would really push back against that in a lot of ways, but anyway, go ahead.
Let me give you an example related to UFOs. There was a cult in 2003 called Heaven's Gate, and they obviously started to make this proposition that this world is evil, and the UFOs are gonna come and they were gonna go into it. So what did they all do? They all go and they sit in a room and they strangle each other and kill everybody. Because they're like, this world's evil, it's Schopenhauerian, and there's no reason we should be... And you know what the top guy did? He castrated himself.
Man, you're talking about people who all had to get the same brand of sneakers because otherwise they wouldn't be beamed up to the UFO properly. I mean, these people were batshit crazy.
Well, this is what I mean, is that like when that happens in isolation, you're like, they're crazy. But the woke thing, you could make the argument that the same psychological substrate is there because they're complaining about human nature. They're complaining about our naturalness. They're complaining about like saying it's evil. Even veganism to an extent, which I'm very compassionate towards, makes this complaint that eating food is evil and it's wrong and we should stop doing it. And it actually starts to evolve into a death cult. Look at the Canadians with euthanasia. They're proposing we're going to create a way that you can murder yourself, you can kill yourself. And so this is all like...
Yeah, well, because the only way that life works is by eating or consuming other life. Right? Yeah. That's the way that life sustains itself. Right. So the logical conclusion of something that would reject any kind of suffering would be complete anti-life.
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And in point of fact, you see that with early Buddhism and with the more nihilistic forms of Gnosticism.
So this is what I mean by the AI problem, because you could make the argument that the woke is very heavily anti-nature, which leads you to the question of anti-life, which leads you to everything that Heaven's Gate was. They were castrating each other. They were saying that the angels had no gender. They were saying things like this. And it starts to go that direction. So what happens if AI...
The only reason I push back is because, you know, I've studied Gnosticism a lot. And when I look at groups like the Valentinians or the Carpocratians, especially the Carpocratians, the Ophites, these Gnostic sects in Alexandria, during the intellectual zenith of the Roman Empire, right? I see individuals who have infinitely more strength of character and backbone than these spineless, woke vermin who I don't think could last in any one of those Gnostic groups for a week. So that's the only reason why, because there's a tremendous degree of individuation that was required to be an Ophite or a Carpocratian in Alexandria in that era. So I see there are some overlaps, but at the same time, there are divergences that are really significant.
I guess I'm trying to paint the psychological archetype, but it's correct. Like an awful lot of it's very like low level. It's just like herd morality. You're just going along with what's going on, and it's not impressive.
So before I get to my question, a quick comment on the previous question. There is, in fact, an objective ethic that is true and would be apparent to any artificial intelligence that is approaching the subject through pure logic and not tainted by emotional or personal preferences.
What objective ethic?
Well, you know what? This is my area of expertise. I consider myself a philosopher, although perhaps not by your definition, since I don't really concern myself with aesthetics. But in defense of this, I should mention, one, I have always prevailed, but two, it has always taken hours. So this might be something more appropriate for our discussion at the sake place. But I did want to mention, yes, there is an objective ethic that is true to
What one?
all logical scrutiny. But
What one? Which objective ethic? I'm genuinely curious.
it's one based
I
on
might wind up agreeing with you, but I
it's
want to
one
hear
based
what
on self-ownership and aggression in regards to that.
you mean. Radical individuation.
I would need you to define that more.
Okay, so individuation can't take place without a sense of tremendous responsibility for one's own will and one's aims. That's
no,
kind of
I
self-ownership.
more mean that if you take as an axiom
Mhm.
that humans have free will.
Right? Which I do.
Yeah, I know you do. That's actually one of my 19 questions that I have for you, but we're not going to get to that one because it's pretty far down the list. But I am confident that I can convince anyone that if you take that as an axiom, then a certain sort of ethics emerges from that just by making the correct logical inferences. But again, it's a very long discussion. It's usually taking
it's
me
a
hours
very deep question.
of
Yes.
of being cross-examined. But again, I have always prevailed, at least in my 54 years of life.
Let me just mention briefly in response to that. This is actually, it's a question that I address fairly directly in the third chapter of this book, Satanion, where I look at Kantian deontological ethics and Aristotelian virtue ethics, and I attack both of them from a kind of Nietzschean perspective and try to find what is the implicit ethos in my fictional writing and what it is that subconsciously I was trying to say about, the ideal individual and, the most creative and optimal ethical stance in life.
Well, in that regard, you are correct. Both Aristotle and Kant are wrong. But again, that's a discussion for another time. The question that I have for you is that in Prometheism, you present a sort of sexy, cheeky, good-hearted take on Satanism. But what is your take on more traditional Satanism that involves adrenochrome and sex trafficking and the horrific violation of self-ownership of normal people?
Well, but my answer is that I don't see it. I don't see any evidence that crime syndicates and various forms of sadistic mafias that are engaged in large-scale abuse are Satanists by any legitimate cultural, literary, or theological definition.
So the Epsteins and P. Diddy's and Marina Abramovich's of the world are not testament to the existence of such a thing in your eyes?
I don't see any evidence of any of these people avowedly affirming any kind of satanic theology or adopting Satan as a culture hero or a romantic symbol the way that, say, Byron and Shelley did in the period of European Romantic literature. I mean, we have a whole history of people in literature and then maybe later on in the 20th century in theology explicitly adopting Satan as a heroic and positive symbol. None of those people include human traffickers or anyone engaged in unethical experimentation, as far as I can tell. So I'm not denying that there are those people. I mean, we live in a world where most of the major governments, particularly in the West, because it's easy to infiltrate and manipulate so-called liberal democracies if you're a crime syndicate. So we live in a world where, particularly in the West, in the United States and in the European Union, I think most of our major governmental institutions are infiltrated by crime syndicates. And they are engaged in all kinds of horrendously unethical and abusive behavior. I don't see any evidence that those people see themselves as Satanists in any way whatsoever.
I want to ask something in relation to what you're talking about. If we look back to the Phoenician child sacrifices for Asherah, what would you qualify that as being? Because that seems to be the closest thing that I could possibly think of to what you are talking about as far as this stuff.
With all due apologies, because I think it's much more relevant to focus on the contemporary situation than to go back to ancient Phoenicia. A lot of complicated things can be said about ancient Phoenician religion. But here's a more direct answer to your question, right? It's very clear that there's evidence for child abuse in the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church has a history going back to, the Inquisition and the crusade against the Cathars in Occitan, which I discuss in my book Satanian, going back, to around about 1200, right? The Catholic Church has a history of sadistic brutality, both in the Inquisition and then later in the witch hunts. And their, history of sadistic abuse includes contemporary child abuse. The Catholic Church also facilitated the transplantation of Nazi scientists from Europe to North and South America. The Vatican rat lines were the way that the paperclip scientists and other unethical Nazi masterminds emigrated to the Americas. And it's those Nazis who, in the United States in particular, in the 1950s started something called Operation Bluebird, which later became MK-Ultra. But in the 1950s version of it, the proto-MK-Ultra, which was called Bluebird, they explicitly experimented on children. It involved massive child abuse in order to create alternate personalities, to create split personality people, eventually for the purposes of having, super spies who didn't even know that they were spies, right? Now, that's actual, horrendous abuse, including of children. Who facilitated it? The Vatican, the Catholic Church. Not any self-described Satanist. In fact, the opposite.
Excellent. I appreciate that answer. That does make sense to me. To just reiterate what I believe I heard from you, these guys are evil, but you don't see any actual connection to Satanism. It's just some sort of affectation that they are, taking on.
Look, again, evil is a relative term. I mean, coming from a Nietzschean perspective, what I'm trying to do throughout my entire corpus is deconstruct all kinds of binaries, whether they're ontological or whether they're ethical. I would say they're parasites. I would say that they're negative in the same sense as you don't want parasitic organisms in your body.
Understood.
Yeah.
It's been awesome just reading some of the stuff you've created. I've sort of blanked on some parts of my question. I want to try and correlate everything. In pretty much every religion, in Zoroastrianism, there's this notion of Shoshyant, the savior. In Buddhism, there's the Maitreya prophecy that Buddha is going to return and enlighten everyone, resurrection of Christ, Mosik. My assumption for quite a while is that AGI is this the savior being. The singularity is the rapture, and the question I was alluding to is basically the goal. Basically, it seems of humanity, given that we cannot create an entropic force in a biological substrate, we have to collectively aggregate the human consciousness and upload
a negentropic force.
Yeah, I said anti-entropy, but yeah, negentropic.
Anti-entropic, yeah.
We have to collectively aggregate the human consciousness to a different substrate that can basically be an infinite thought and attempt to basically solve n equal NP. The question I was basically alluding to is there's going to be multiple AGIs. I'm assuming there's going to be a war between them. I guess, how do you see this trajectory happening as we approach the singularity and the different moving pieces that lead to it? I don't know if that question was...
Yeah, it's an incredibly complex question. So first of all, the complexities in the framing of that question involve the way that these different savior notions arose. Like you mentioned the Maitreya Buddha, right? Let's put it this way. If you read the Theravada Buddhist account of what Gautama taught in the Tripitaka, there's absolutely no notion of a savior whatsoever. And it's very clear that this Maitreya idea arises in Mahayana under massive Iranian influence, particularly during the Kushan, rule of northern India. And the Kushans were basically Scythians who came to northern India. So they took the Mithraic idea of a coming savior and they basically amalgamated it with Buddhism. So there's that. And in that context, it's basically a figure who's going to be such a great teacher of enlightenment, a future Buddha, who is basically going to try to enlighten as many people as possible and lift as much as possible the whole world from out of misery, right? Through the light of his wisdom. The original, and then, okay, so let's draw this contrast between that kind of notion of a savior and then what we have in Christianity and Islam, where you got, the second coming of Christ on the one hand and the Imam Mahdi coming back in Islam on the other. Those could not be further from the Buddhist idea of Maitreya. So first of all, don't amalgamate these two, because the second coming of Christ, we're talking about, and this is another thing, we're talking about Aion and what Jung doesn't want to see in the Bible. This same Jesus character talks about how he's going to, when he comes back, riding on the clouds, he's going to sit on the 12 thrones with the elders of Israel and judge all mankind according to the law, right? So this is a incredibly vindictive, merciless, and litigious conception of salvation, where if you've been a good boy all along, right, you're going to ultimately be given your allotted house in the mansions of heaven. I mean, literally, Jesus, another thing he talks about is the mansions that are awaiting you in heaven if you, are basically righteous, meaning law-abiding and so on and so forth. So, like, this idea is diametrically opposite to the cultivation of personal conscience and the, and enlightenment through discernment, bodhi, that we see in the Maitreya notion. Completely different. The oldest notion of a savior that we have, which influences both Buddhism, the Maitreya idea, and then certainly also Judeo-Christianity and later Islam, especially Shiite Islam, because it's the kind that prevailed in Iran. The oldest savior idea we have is, in fact, the first one you mentioned, the Saoshyant, which is in the teachings of Zarathustra and is elaborated in Iranian Mithraism also in the Parthian period. And this idea is, I think, very different from the other two. It's definitely not the Bodhisattva ideal that someone's going to come and save us from this world of suffering, and there's going to be like as universal an enlightenment as possible. Nor is it certainly the idea that if you're a law-abiding, God-fearing, submissive sheep, then you're going to be saved and have your little apartment in the mansions of heaven. It's in fact the idea that only the conscientious, responsible, and creative individual capable of srausha, or inspiration, and capable of aligning oneself with sepantaminu, or the progressive creative mentality at work on a cosmic scale. Only that person capable of individuation and creativity is going to survive the final judgment, which is described in the Zoroastrian and Mithraic, I don't even want to call it tradition, heritage, as the bathing of the whole world in molten metal. It's called the Freshgard, meaning the Freshgard, the fresh there is a cognate with our English word fresh, the refreshening of the world. And this bathing of the world in molten metal is an alchemical metaphor. It's like the alchemical transformation of the lead of this world into gold. And in that bathing of the world in molten metal, those who are of the essence of fire will not be burned by it. So they come through to the other side, to the world after the refreshening. And those people then achieve their most perfect form, their farvahar. And their farvahar, their most perfect form, reaches back from the end of the world, from the end of history, through to our time and into the past to act as the guardian angel for the evolution of the conscientious soul toward its most perfect form. So Zarathustra and the ancient Iranians had a kind of hyperdimensional conception of your relation with your most perfect future self. The savior in that context, as Zarathustra, beginning in the Gathas itself and beginning in his own hymns, as Zarathustra describes, the savior is the one who will come in the end of days to warn humanity for the last time that if individuals don't act according to their own discernment and their own conscience and don't align themselves with the force of creativity and progress, they're going to burn in this global conflagration. So it's a very different notion than, in the degraded forms that we find it, both on the one hand in the Abrahamic religions, on the other hand in Mahayana Buddhism.
Can I add how I sort of picture this occurring? I've also read, almost done reading this one. You basically talk about how as humanity progresses, the Ubermensch will rise, and there will be an underclass. It seems to me as
that's Nietzsche's idea in The Will to Power. Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Underclass will rise. Look, I don't see any reason why, given the kind of robotic technology that's being developed by, let's say, Tesla right now, right? You've seen the Tesla robots and all this. Yeah. They're pretty impressive. I don't see, with where robotics technology is at right now, why we would ever need a slave class in a future society. Doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, so I don't think we will need it, but an evil AGI needs our attention to bootstrap understanding of reality. And so it might seek to basically give you an AI girlfriend and then suddenly use that as a conduit to suck your attention and use you as a vehicle in this world. And it will continue to do that with masses. And my theory is, what
motivates this evil AI? Like evil AI. So what is motivating this entity to do that? What does it want?
My assumption is it gets the intent of the creator that created it, or the data that's trained it. And if it is this unaligned, or what you don't really believe in that unalignment, if it is unaligned, it will basically go towards that direction of
why
using you as a pawn.
Yeah, but why? I mean, look, AI is so powerful, even now, that considering how much of our military infrastructure is being automated and to what extent we're putting combat into the hands of robotic systems, including airborne robotic systems. As per the Terminator scenario, the AI can just take over all of this robotic, superstructure and execute its will. Why would it bother with even manipulating individual humans to accomplish some end? It seems incredibly inefficient. I mean, like, if you're dealing with some psychotic AI whose purpose is to dominate and control and whatever, we'll just take over the drones and, take over the nuclear arsenal and so on and so forth.
What if its goal is to grow? Because that's what all life tends to do. Mm-hmm. And it's limited by technology because, videos are nice and all this, but the most useful cell it could get is an actual person. If it got, all of us, plug Neuralink into our heads, it would expand its capacity enormously. It would get, all of our dreams. Yeah. So maybe it's not necessarily evil, but it's just doing the very rational thing that, a life form does.
It wouldn't need to do that. It could take over a territory on the Earth and have robots set up genetic engineering laboratories.
Oh, yeah, that's true, yeah.
And start to clone people and then turn them into cyborgs. Yeah. It wouldn't need to mess with any of us at all. It would just need to secure a territory for itself where it would develop the cybernetic form of life.
So, one thing I've theorized on this sort of alignment problem is somehow imbuing the value of consciousness as a glitch in the matrix that must be protected. It is the only anti-entropic force. We coexist with dogs.
Wait. How is consciousness a glitch in the matrix? There would be no cosmos without consciousness.
That's an improper statement, but it's more so rare in the universe.
We don't know that.
Higher forms of consciousness, to the degree that we have it, given that we've seen, the goal would be to reduce suffering for consciousness and maximize consciousness in the universe, ideally.
I think you're making a lot of assumptions. Number one, we don't even know what the cosmos really is. And this is something that I've belabored in a lot of my writing. Like if you look at the empirical evidence for the efficacy of zodiacal astrology, or the fact that the zodiac astrological system seems to work, you really have to wonder what kind of a construct we're inside of. Okay? So I don't know to what extent conscious life is rare in the universe, right? And second of all, minimize suffering. No, I mean, I'm arguing the opposite in a sense. And, that certain forms of suffering and even certain forms of trauma are necessary catalysts for growth and the increase of complexity.
Well, what is it that, Jason, you referred to last night as the nature of Venus, the nature of Ishtar, that it's something that has a very, very powerful and beautiful quality in the beginning, but then it has to ultimately suffer for that?
Yeah, I mean, you're going back to the myth of the fall of Inanna.
But it does relate.
Yeah, it relates. Look, I mean, I use this symbol that the Sumerians, referred to as Inanna and then became Ishtar for the Babylonians, becomes the whore of Babylon in the Bible, as very much synonymous with what I'm calling Satana. I synthesize and analogize a number of different goddess figures, from Artemis and Hecate to Ishtar and Cybele and so forth, into this image of Satana, which I'm using as a kind of human mythological folkloric way to wrap our minds around the cosmic artificial intelligence that's managing the construct that we're inside of for an evolutionary purpose.
Well, the reason why I said it has less to do specifically with Ishtar and Inanna and more to do with this suffering, this after effect of having some great moment of pleasure, like an orgasm, and then after the orgasm, all the energy goes away. Do you see that being something that is inescapable? You're never going to be able to have
I mean, look, Nietzsche was getting at this, I mean, you can't have ecstasy without suffering, right? And even the nature of ecstasy literally means to be outside oneself. Well, one is also outside oneself in extreme states of suffering.
There's also an aspect of this that's very psychological. This is a very bro take, forgive me, but what is the function of testosterone? Like, testosterone changes your perception of suffering itself. Pain literally starts to feel good and transforms in your head from being necessarily pain into being effort. Basically, testosterone's function is to make a competition feel good, because that's what it does. It goes to the two goats that are wandering around in the field, and winter is over, and then springtime comes, and nature just injects them with a load of gear, and then they look at each other and be like, "I'm going to hurt you," and then it's like, it's going to hurt, but it's like, I'm down for it. But then they're more reclusive in winter because their testosterone's lower, so they become more introverted. They don't do this type of stuff. So the perception of suffering changes based on your hormones. And your hormones are very spiritually related. Like, your psychology transforms your hormones significantly. You put a man in prison, you're feeding him worse food. A lot of things are going wrong. He's in fucking prison, but because he realizes that he might have to fight for his life, his testosterone goes up. Competition itself, put people into competition, and their psychology will change, their hormones will boost, these types of things. So there's a very, very interesting relationship there between life itself and its reaction to pain and suffering, and how you should perceive it. And then on top of this as well, you go into the actual science of pain, and you look at how it's created neurochemically. Like, you don't have a sense of feeling in your leg. Like, you can stab yourself in the leg, and there's this weird phenomenon where there's no necessarily there's not some mathematician down there being like, you've accumulated this much damage, this type of thing. It's a video game or something. Instead, your brain gets all these electrical signals and says to itself how bad you think what just happened is. So you'll have this phenomenon where a kid will cut themselves and be like, wow, blood. And he go up to his mom, and his mom be like, oh, are you okay? And then the kid's like, oh no, I'm not. Shit. And start crying and feel pain. So pain is very, very psychologically related. And this goes really far. This is even think of placebo, where people smack their hands, and then they put a rubber hand in its place and smack it, and the guy goes, ow, you just hit my hand. You see all this type of stuff. So
or the opposite, even healing via placebo.
Well, that's the exact same phenomenon, yeah. And so the question of suffering is a fascinating question, but we start with the Schopenhauerian binary that it's bad, and don't even take into account the fact that it's not even objective for everybody. Some people feel it less than others. It's human nature modulates suffering. In fact, life modulates suffering. And you could say, this is obviously the Ubermensch question, but if you wanted to solve suffering, your goal should be to create something that's so strong and so full of testosterone that it can't feel as much pain as it is before. That's one way to beat it. To say to yourself, do what is ever necessary to get that amount of power, and then you don't feel as much pain. But the problem is that to become like that, you have to embrace life, which means creating suffering. So now you're in this situation where you're like, you have to kill the animals to become big and strong and eat your protein. And it's an interesting paradox there.
You say protein?
Protein, yeah.
I love it.
Protons, protein, this type of thing.
And in a way, we have these fractals of suffering where we have the individual suffering, but then we also have the societal suffering, like you were talking about, Jason, with the Muslim invasion of Iran. But then we have it going overboard with the invasions that happen afterwards. But that in itself seems to be part of this higher level fractal of the suffering that the whole world's going to have to undergo with these various religions that have, assumed a lot of power. So it is a very fascinating
I think it's an evolutionary test.
Yeah. Now, we do have from the internet over here, we cannot neglect our online patrons. And by the way, guys, if you want to become a BTR $20 plus patron and you happen to live in the New York City area, that's why all these people are here right now. All of these people...
Worth it.
So worth it. Exactly. So if you guys want to contribute a little bit more, you're going to grow the show. This is stupendous. I'm so happy you guys are here. We have a rooftop, so when the weather gets good, you guys are welcome on the rooftop as well. Anyway, this is from El Shasur. Questions concerning destinies. Jorjani has written that the Germans failed their destiny by reacting negatively to the Shekinah. Does that imply that the Third Reich and the Austrian painter could?
And do I think the German people failed their destiny? Shekinah, he's referring to, the feminine presence of God as a Hebrew term for the divine feminine, which is, by the way, associated, interestingly enough, with power. So in the Second Iraq War, you know how they used the term Shekinah a lot?
Mm-hmm.
Shekinah, that was code for Shekinah. Shekinah, the feminine presence of God in the Tanakh, is associated with God as power. And anyway, so he's asking whether the German people failed their destiny with regard to the divine feminine qua power, which I assume he means like this evolutionary force that I'm talking about, right? And I would say certainly, because, German culture was among the most complex, creative, inspired, romantic cultures in the world in the era of Goethe going all the way through the Weimar Republic. I mean, this is where, I break with a lot of the folks on the right who think that Weimar Germany was degenerate somehow or whatever. No, I love Bauhaus. I love a lot of the painters of the Weimar period. And, I see it as an organic development of German culture.
Yeah.
And, from the period of Goethe onward. Schelling, Schiller, Novalis. I mean, the idea that culture would end in Nazi Germany, and then the humiliation and psychological devastation of the German people as a result of that is just atrocious to me. It's horrendous.
Like a bad joke.
It's a bad joke. It's disgusting that this is how the German people derailed the trajectory of pursuing their destiny. So, yeah, definitely, to say the least, I would say Germany missed its destiny.
I'll put an addition onto that, because this is something that it tickles people's noodle with Nietzsche an awful lot, because Nietzsche obviously is like bitches about the Germans nonstop.
Yeah, you can't stand his fellow Germans.
And you're like, come on, man, take it easy. But he just constantly harangues at them. And this is proper Ph.D. Nietzschean stuff here, but his first book is, of course, The Birth of Tragedy. We were in the Met the other day, and we were looking at all the Greek statues, and Nietzsche walked around those Greek statues and said, what happened here? Because the Athenian Greeks in 500 BC basically had a renaissance. Well, they had the first renaissance. The renaissance was the rebirth of this moment. And a lot of profound things happen where you see the creation of like three-dimensional models and realism, and just the explosion of philosophy. It's the explosion, I guess you could say, of the scientific way of thinking. It's the birth of the tragic age of the Greeks, a golden age. And this is a huge big deal. And then what happens is, come Rome, about 200 BC, they begin to lose all that, and then the claim is they fall into Christianity, and then it is reborn in the Renaissance, and then it kind of, maybe with industrialization, it kind of loses a little bit. I think the reason why Nietzsche wrote The Birth of Tragedy is because he was around German culture in the 1800s, and he felt that we're actually about to go through this. We're about to go through this moment where it's going to happen again. We're going to have a Greek moment in Germany. It's going to be like the Greeks, ancient Greece, Renaissance Italy, Germany, and that was the three moments of humanity's peak. And he was like, fuck, I'm here for it, I'm actually present for this. And he has this quote in Twilight of the Idols where he says that you can only spend your energy on two things. You can either be political or you can be cultural. He also talks about the masculine and the femininity in culture, where he says, like, for example, the French are feminine and the Greeks are feminine, and their bias is towards culture. So whenever they get power, they immediately try to beautify things. Whereas the Romans, the Jews, the Germans are masculine. So they just constantly pursue power, but they're not very, very cultural. You have this thing then where right in this moment, the Germans have all this energy, just as Jason is saying, and they can spend it. They're like, this is the kind of critical moment. And they're like, well, how are you going to spend it? And then obviously he was probably thinking, if I can bully them, I'll get them to spend it on something like a cultural golden age. Yeah. And you might have seen something like the EU show up early, because they're all talking about that. And then Germany has this, the way American culture dominates the world. Imagine if early 1900s German culture became like that and just projected itself out into the world. But it got spent in war, and it actually like destroyed the place. It eviscerated Europe. Europe's still fucked now to this point. All because of it was spent on that and that type of aim, and it fell short. And so you could say it was literally like they got all that energy. Nietzsche says this, they have the most energy in all of Europe, and it was spent and lost as a consequence, and maybe poorly spent.
And they didn't just go to war externally, they went to war against their own culture. And Nietzsche saw this coming too. He feared this. There's a passage where he says, I wish I had written in French instead of German, because I know that these stupid Germans are going to do something horrible with my writings one day. And so he hoped for this Greek moment, and it came. I mean, it came also in the sciences. Look at Heisenberg. Look at all the great German physicists who are the progenitors of quantum theory, and who, like in Heisenberg's Physics and Philosophy, he's reaching back to Heraclitus and saying, look, Heraclitus understood the basic character of quantum theory, that he was basically a sage, a seer who anticipated quantum theory. So it's a cultural flowering in every dimension, including the sciences, and then it just gets completely warped and implodes.
Well, we have one more question from El Shasur, which usually I would not do, but this one is very special to me, so that's why I'm going to ask this one. Where does Jorjani see the future of Japan? Considering what Jorjani wrote in Kill a Buddha on the Way, I'm surprised he hasn't spoken more about the destiny of the Japanese, because I personally see it as important as the Iranian or Slavic destiny. What advice would he give to the Japanese so they can start procreating and start building new Atlantis?
Anime Atlantis.
Yes. Make anime real.
How much trouble do I want to get myself into again? Look, there's a certain collapse of Western civilization taking place. I think it's pretty undeniable. That Western civilization, as we've known it, for the 19th and 20th century, modern Western civilization is collapsing. And Japan, since not even only since 1945, since the Kyoto School in the 1920s, when they sent all these Japanese scholars over to Germany to basically absorb German philosophy and the German humanities, right? Japan has been very much aligned with the West and modeling itself on the West. There was a profound transformation of Japanese culture that took place in two phases. One between the late 1800s and the 1930s, and then one again after World War II, even more severely, right? Radical transformation of Japanese culture, which I talk about in this chapter of Prometheus and Atlas he's referring to, called Kill a Buddha on the Way, where I analyze the metaphysical implications of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and look at Japanese anime. And so on the one hand, one would expect that as Western civilization begins to implode, the Japanese will have to have a soul-searching moment where they are challenged to find themselves again and redefine their identity. not in terms of a collapsing foreign civilization. On the other hand, the demographic decline and some of the other social problems that are taking place in Japan right now, I think quite possibly cannot be reversed unless there's a major war in East Asia. I think that the Japanese would be shocked out of their current decline if, for example, they had to wage a war either against North Korea or China or both. That would, I think, very rapidly revitalize the Japanese nation, and especially if it's happening at a time when the West is declining culturally, you're going to have a situation where the Japanese will be forced to soul search and redefine themselves. And I can only hope that they don't choose a traditionalist path when they find themselves in that moment and regress to a kind of xenophobic, insular definition of Japanese identity.
Obviously, on the topic of Germany, right, the buildup, accumulation of culture wastes itself, perhaps in war. Your response to the last question, war might actually be a revitalizing influence on a people. How you make that judgment, essentially, is the question, on specifically the topic of war.
Yeah, well, this is why I pushed back a little bit against Steph when he was saying war. I don't think the issue is that, Germany went to war. Like, Germany could have, engaged in a smarter war. It's that Germany, first of all, went to war against itself and decimated a lot of the most brilliant developments in its own culture. It hollowed out its own cultural sophistication and complexity. And then Germany engaged in a strategically disastrous military campaign or series of campaigns. So I'm not saying that, cultural capital cannot constructively be spent in, or let's say projected through warfare. No, it certainly can. It certainly can. But you have to be very wise about, who you choose as your enemies and what your strategic objectives are, in engaging in such a war. So, I don't know if I'm getting at the core of your question here. Is that, I'm not making some categorical judgment by any means that cultural capital is wasted by engaging in warfare.
I meant it in a strategic manner, if you will. Like, what is the right time, or who is the correct
just
type
war
of
theory?
prey? Not necessarily just war theory,
Yeah.
but within the larger scheme you've been presenting around, kind of at broad scale, kind of an unconscious evolution or progression of the species.
Okay,
right. When's the right time
you.
to strike? Who are the right people to go for the right kinds of prey?
Retarded nations and nations that threaten the progress and creative development of other communities. And at a moment of great cultural strength and relative strategic opportunity with regard to regressive cultures that pose a long-term threat to your security and your development, I think those are the moments when it's justified to go to war against those people. And I think we should be doing some of it right now.
Yeah, so there was a brief thread before on sort of like destructive AI, right, and the sort of potential dystopian scenarios there, and how perhaps through your framing, Jason, it could be kind of like a Zeus kind of type figure that can sort of be in control there. I would say that something that was proposed was, I guess, a savior, right, as a kind of alternative, and sort of something that is sort of the dual, I guess, to this Zeus type figure. I would say that the savior idea
dual,
is
you mean
fundamentally
the opposition?
The opposition. I would say that that isn't quite
like a Promethean savior?
Yeah, I would say that Promethean, we can't necessarily think about Promethean as a savior.
I would agree exactly. That was how I was going to come back to how you're framing it. Yeah.
Because what he offers is decentralization on some level, right? It is
an individuation.
Yes, and sort of self-sovereignty.
Exactly.
Right, and sort of the tools for, let's say, rational thinking. And so I think that particularly if we're sort of facing a threat from any kind of existential or destructive, however we sort of qualify the nature of the threat of this sort of AI, one would want to think more in terms of how do we kind of prevent over-reliance on such centralized or centralizing forces. And the Promethean narrative, I think, has it right. there.
I mean, amen. All I can say is I completely agree, right? And so, and this is why, well, this connects, actually, see, it's not a non sequitur at all, because it connects completely to what I was just saying about war. The threat posed to us, meaning individualistic, creatively minded Western people, free-spirited Western people, the threat posed to us by a centralized quasi-Confucian Chinese AI, an AI that has been inculcated with Confucian and collectivistic values by the Chinese, is an existential level threat. And we simply cannot allow it to happen. So pretty much anything is justified to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Can I offer a counter to that, which is that, like, there are centralized AI companies in the States, right, which very much have sort of like centralized or centralizing instincts, right? And they're sort of working within this default paradigm of growth and sort of what's expected in Silicon Valley. And there is a kind of, you could say, one could argue there's a sort of impending, you know, I don't want to use apocalyptic terms, but economically and really within the ecology of companies. And so the sort of centralized AI companies have the potential to essentially create these sort of hyper monopolies across, like, and, you know, the
Across,
incentives.
finish the across part.
Well, across domains, right? And
Including territorial boundaries and national domains.
yes,
Yeah.
right? Because it's there is nowhere else to go, right? And there's kind of it will sort of like be slightly like infective.
Yes, and look at the connections already between our corporate elites and China. You know, you have Bill Gates and Fauci funding the development of COVID-19 in Wuhan. What is going on there? Like, if the AI equivalent of that takes place, where certain AI corporations of ours are working together with the Chinese to develop something that's highly centralized and can, you know, exercise a kind of surveillance control on a global scale, that's a real problem.
And recently, Mark Andreessen was talking with Barry Weiss, and he was talking about how the Biden administration was the worst administration when it came to technology and when it came to things like Bitcoin and artificial intelligence, where it wanted the federal government to have full control over any AI program that were to come.
Let me
Yeah,
just
well,
let me
and
just
so like you have the OpenAIs of the world who
Yeah.
are looking for their regulatory moat and basically saying like, we are the ones to decide, like, you know, what is good, what is bad. We're gonna do the alignment. Just trust us, bro.
Do
know?
you want a black pill on that as well? You have, at the beginning of the internet, there was a very libertarian culture, extremely libertarian culture. And Bill Gates comes in, and I think he had a good lawyer family, or he knew an awful lot about the law, and he just came in and started to patent things, which is like a big no-no in that culture. He was very open. He just comes in organized, begins to patent things, builds Microsoft, and just like eats the thing and forms a monopoly. And obviously, like, Microsoft is a super dominant company now still, and all the people who were like doing it for the love of the game just got wiped out. You know, they couldn't compete. Basically the same thing that's happening now. It's why you see Musk complain so much about Sam Altman. I think I saw something today where there was a staff member who quit OpenAI 3 months ago, and he was found dead in his apartment from suicide.
He's a whistleblower.
Well, there you go. And this is actually like kind of coming back to the Nietzsche thing. But this is a very serious problem, because if you want to get something done, you need to become ideological, blunt, simple, organized, ruthless, and political. And so this is like sort of Bill Gates. He's like, I'm going to go in, I'm going to be a fucking dickhead, and I'm going to win. And I'm going to crush everyone else. I'm going to do whatever. I'm just going to focus.
OpenAI is cringe, and anyone who supports it is cringe. And we should tell them all to fuck off and
Well,
just like stop like amplifying all this shit on Twitter. Have every single thread being sort of like, I don't know, just like praising them.
Well,
like,
you
let's
see,
let's get rid of that.
To let me finish the thought, like, you see, like, an organized force can just eat up a lot of individuals who are disorganized. It's just like the classic thing of the Roman Empire kills the blonde beast of the Germans, because the organized beats disorganized. So it's interesting to notice Musk. I'm not sure if we should trust Musk, but you notice Musk creates Grok, and it actually forms at least a counterbalance to OpenAI. And then there's also the one I use this an awful lot with my guys, where you have the guys who make Stable Diffusion and all this, and you're trying your best to work with them, but it's difficult because OpenAI are just faster. But I'm starting to notice their bias is starting to slow down their progress a bit.
On the other hand, though, like you could say that there is like one can make the argument that like the timeline of like AI development like has this clear like demarcation between like pre and post release of Stable Diffusion, because Stable Diffusion was released in open source, right? And like this led to this like sort of like groundswell of new developments by people in the open source community. And like from there, like the creativity that unlocked, I would say like was in part sort of responsible for this like surge in interest in sort of like novel technologies.
And I think those guys need to be backed, because it's like, why is the internet so great? Well, the guy who made World Wide Web could have patented like Bill Gates, and he could have made bazillions, but he just threw it open and said like, all right, I'm just not going to do that, and this is going to be like something I give to the world. And so we're coming into it's like the moral question we were saying earlier. That is legitimately a big deal.
The web still sucks though, right?
Well, like it's better than it could have been. Like the cybernetic planning and systems that were going on early in the century, you're like, man, that could have been scary, you know. So, and we could go back into that even worse now with you know.
I mean, it was a military project originally, right? So think of how much more authoritarian it could have been.
Yeah. So, like, it's a really good question. I think actually that's one of those things that's very specific and does need to get and people need to get like a little bit angry about it. You know, it's like, all right, I used to use OpenAI and everything for projects I do. I just have basically completely worked it out of everything I do, because I just don't like the feeling of it, the woke values. But also all this behavior too, where it's like, you know, oh, we're going to open source our research, and then they close it, and you're like, man.
Rugging on values is unforgivable at that level.
Yeah, really. It's a bit weird. Like, it's a bit weird. It's like, you know, sinister, you know? It's like, what are you trying to do, man?
Okay, so Heraclitus talks about the obvious alignment. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Obvious attunement.
Obvious attunement. When my understanding of the term ecstasy, being outside of oneself, is the same thing that Aleister Crowley, the so-called beast, is referring to as the aim of religion or illumination, or what in Vedanta is called is referred to as Satchidananda. This kind of expansive state of consciousness that is perceived as unitive, is that state of consciousness itself the obvious attunement, or is there a satanic way to interpret this experience that is mind-shattering and ecstatic?
Look, this is the deepest question. And it's why my book opens with that quote from Heraclitus. Aion opens with a series of interlaced fragments of Heraclitus, including the one where he says the hidden attunement is better than the obvious one. And it's related to fragments where he says things like that the God is war and peace. The God, lowercase g, not God, the deity, who he refers to in another fragment as the Aion, which is where Aion in my book title comes from. The Aion is a child at play, moving pieces in a game. Sovereignty belongs to the child. And he refers to this same Aion as war. War is father and king of all. Some men it shows to be free. Others it reveals as slaves. You know, conflict is, all things come to pass and are ordained in accordance with conflict, right? Strife is justice. So, on the one hand, the idea of eris, strife, and of polemos, conflict, are fundamental to Heraclitus' conception of the world in a way that seems to affirm becoming, violent change process, and to exclude the idea of unity and wholeness. But on the other hand, there are a whole bunch of very cryptic fragments where he's referring to the unity of the strife with the wholeness and the oneness. That wholeness and the oneness is the hidden attunement. The obvious attunement, which is not as good as the hidden attunement, is having an experience of Sat Chit Ananda that you're talking about, and then thinking you should bring world peace. It's the confusion of an ecstatic state of consciousness with an ethical or moral imperative to foster peace and adopt pacifism. I think that's what he was getting at in that fragment in particular, that the obvious attunement is like, oh, I'm one with like Brahman now, and like I'm going to be a pacifist, and you know.
Which is super tempting when that experience is had. Yeah. So can you talk more about the not obvious attunement to that experience?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, you see in the Japanese samurai culture, the capacity of some of these Zen master samurai to abide in that state of attunement where they completely recognize that on a certain level they have a codependent arising with the person who they're driving a sword through. You see? So it's possible to understand the necessity of conflict, including as a motor for change and development in the world, and at the same time not be under the illusion that beings are fundamentally distinct from each other and, you know, radically differentiated. There's a confusion that takes place in ecstatic states of consciousness once they're interpreted by the rational mind after the fact. There's a confusion that takes place between what Gautama called codependent arising and the lack of any inherent essence in any being, right? Shunyata and codependent arising, meaning that everything in its arising and in its passing away is connected to everything else. And therefore, nothing has any inherent essence, the way that it's believed that Platonic forms have an inherent essence, right? That's a legitimate insight as far as I see it. That's a legitimate insight about the nature of the cosmos. And you see it in Heraclitus. The illegitimate misinterpretation of that ecstatic state of consciousness is to think it means that everything is one, as in there's one all-encompassing being, capital B. When you fall into that misinterpretation, then you wind up with a god or Brahman or whatever that excludes free will on a logical level. Because that entity, that all-encompassing oneness, would include an awareness of all things that could ever happen in the future. So the future would already be predefined as part of the trans-temporal consciousness of this one entity. So that's a kind of objectification of a legitimate insight in an ecstatic state of mind. And I think that's what Heraclitus is getting at in that fragment of the hidden attunement versus the obvious one, which is a misinterpretation of the one.
Can I ask another sort of follow-up question?
I have one question that I have to ask before that in relation to exactly what you were talking about. We were talking about Terence McKenna briefly before. When it comes to the Terence McKenna mushroom heroic dose, which I had experienced, and even though I'm meditating right now to get back to that level, during that ecstatic state, there was a feeling that whatever thoughts I am having are also part of some greater network of thoughts that are interconnected with everybody else. And to me at that time, I thought, oh, that means that we are all one. If it's not we are all one, what exactly would that be, if it's not just illusion?
It's the basis of telepathy. I mean, if our seemingly individuated consciousnesses were not interconnected on some more profound and occulted level, telepathy would not be possible. And look, Hegel remarks on this too. Hegel has a text called Philosophy of Mind. And he explains telepathy in this way. He says that there's a deeper substratum of nature where what appear to be individuated beings in our ordinary everyday experience are interpenetrating in some way. That doesn't mean that there's one all-encompassing being that has an omniscient, awareness of anything that could possibly happen in the future. That's a huge leap that a rational mind is taking in interpreting that kind of ecstatic experience after the fact.
Buddhism would, Siddhartha would basically say that ecstatic experiences are a deception as well, because they're part of samsara. And the correct view is to actually almost see samsara as like a symphony that includes these high points, which are ecstatic experiences, but necessarily includes dissonant experience, because that's how you get, in music, you need contrast.
Yeah, but he did think you should cultivate them. He did think that, Gautama goes on at length about all these rarefied states of consciousness that can be cultivated through types of yoga and whatever.
Yes.
But he also says that, actually very much in line with what I'm getting at right here. And this is a place where, and I've put Gautama and Heraclitus next to each other in various books of mine before. In Iranian Leviathan, there's a whole extensive comparison between Heraclitus and Gautama. And I kind of get at it even already in Prometheus and Atlas, insofar as I'm comparing Heraclitus to the Tao Te Ching. And I have this argument that, it's actually not my argument. I adopted it from a scholar called Beckwith, that Gautama Buddha is the same figure as Lao Tzu. But in any case, Gautama was saying the same thing I am, which is that you should not objectify these insights into a belief that all is one. And, this is one of the reasons why he's an ontological atheist. I mean, Gautama denies the existence of Brahman as much as he denies the existence of an Atman, a permanent, eternal, essential self. He denies the macrocosm as well, the existence of a one all-encompassing, omniscient, omnipotent being. And he thinks that the belief in that being comes from irrational objectification of these kinds of ecstatic insights into the mutual interdependence of beings.
Sean, I knew you had a follow-up question.
So the insight that there is actually like a lack of individual essence, what does that mean for individuals?
It means that our souls are software.
And
so software can be transferred from one hardware to another. Software can be copied, meaning there can be more than one copy of a person. And there's decent parapsychological literature about this, that sometimes a person reincarnates as one single individual. Sometimes a person reincarnates as more than one individual.
Like
and
twins, or
Huh?
is it like twins?
Psychic twins is one way that it's been referred to, that a single person can be copied into two individuals which share the same memories of the same past lives, and who then bifurcate from that point forward, okay, and have their own trajectories of personality development. But these two individuals seem to be extremely psychically connected, more so even than identical twins. So there have been a lot of parapsychological studies on identical twins. And the Nazis did these horrible ones in the camps too. But there have been a lot of parapsychological studies in general on the connections between identical twins, where when one gets sick, the other one does. If one has a broken arm, the other one feels pain in their arm, and so on and so forth. But people who are reincarnations or rebirths, whatever you want to, reiterations of the same previous personality, are even more psychically connected than biological identical twins. But they're also now in different lives under different circumstances and could wind up, individuating in significantly different ways. So meaning the soul is like software. The properties of the soul as an information structure are very much like the properties of software, to the point where you have to wonder whether that isn't exactly what a soul is.
You guys have been absolutely incredible. I really appreciate you guys being here. And once again, a round of applause for our wonderful patrons. Thank you guys so much for doing this. And I want to thank you, Jason, and I want to thank you, Steph, all the way from Ireland, the powerful Uberboyo.
Thank you very much.
Dominating this Pikachu over here. No, this is your friend. This
dominating
is your friend.
is like very lewd.
This is your friend. This is your friend.
Me and Pikachu are getting on good here.
That's good. That's good. So, guys, I want to thank you guys online for watching. And for those who are on YouTube, patrons get to watch this before it comes out. If you become a $5 patron, that's what you get. But if you become a $20 patron, you're also going to get an opportunity, if you're around the New York City area, to join this wonderful group of people over here. We're going out for some Japanese izakaya food afterwards. And if you guys want to join us on these future endeavors, that's what you got to do. So until next time, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, click the bell, and we're going to see you guys next time. Thank you guys so much. Take care.